I never thought the happiest day of my life would become the most humiliating. Picture this, a church filled with over 100 guests, flowers lining the aisle. My father holding my trembling hand as the music began to play. I stood at the altar waiting for the man who had promised me forever. But instead of my fiancé walking toward me, it was my sister. My own sister dressed in white with him on her arm. And then my mother's voice rang out across the pews. He chose strength over weakness. He chose her. In that moment, my world shattered. Laughter whispers the sound of cameras clicking the abandoned bride. That's how the newspapers called me the next morning. I left town in my torn wedding dress, vowing that if it took 10 years, I would come back stronger than they ever imagined. And I did. 10 years later, I wasn't the broken bride anymore. I was the woman hosting the grandest party in Chicago. And when my mother, my sister, and the man who once left me walked through the ballroom doors, they froze. Their faces went pale as they saw who stood beside me, hand in mine. Because my husband wasn't just anyone. He was the one man they never expected, and the truth about him would destroy everything they thought they had won. Stay with me. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a story of secrets, revenge, and a final twist so shocking you'll be talking about it long after the last word. My name is Emily Carter, and when this story begins, I was 22 years old, a senior at Northwestern University studying business and communications. On campus, people saw me as the ambitious scholarship student who had her life figured out. Professors praised my dedication, friends admired my focus, and from the outside it looked like everything was falling into place. But once the lecture halls emptied and I boarded the train back to my family's suburban home, the image of the confident young woman dissolved into something far lonelier. At home, I wasn't the promising student. I was the invisible daughter. Every Friday afternoon, after long hours of classes and tutoring work that paid for books and groceries, I would take the purple line into the suburbs and walk the last mile home. The minute I stepped through the front door, the weight of responsibility settled over me like a heavy coat. My father, kind but frail from years of working factory shifts and now dealing with worsening arthritis, needed someone to cook his meals and help him manage medication. The house itself seemed to demand constant attention, dust gathering in the corners, laundry piling up meals that never seemed to cook themselves. Without asking, I slipped into that role. I cooked, I cleaned, I cared. It felt like a duty, but also a way to show I was still worthy of love. My mother never saw it that way. I would set a hot plate of her favorite pot roast on the table, proud of balancing my studies with household chores, only to hear her sigh in disapproval. "You only do this to show off, Emily," she would say, cutting into the meat without looking at me. "It's not from your heart. It's just to make yourself look good." The words stung every time more than I ever admitted. I wanted her to see me as devoted, not pretentious. But in her eyes, no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. Sarah, my older sister, never lifted a finger in the house, but she could do no wrong. She was 25, working a part-time retail job that barely covered her rent yet. One afternoon I came home to find her beaming over a brand new Coach bag. "Mom bought it for me," she explained with a proud little toss of her hair. "She said I deserved it for sticking with my job." I sat there quietly remembering how the week before I had come home with the news that I had been awarded a full academic scholarship for my senior year. Mom's response had been a clipped, "That's nice, but don't get cocky." Sarah's handbag glistened on the table while my scholarship certificate sat buried in my backpack, uncelebrated. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that my worth wasn't measured by my mother's gifts or her careless remarks. Still, I found myself chasing her approval like a child begging for crumbs of affection. I cleaned Sarah's room, folding clothes she had thrown across the floor, organizing makeup scattered across her vanity, even spritzing her favorite perfume to make it feel welcoming. I declined invitations from friends in Evanston, people begging me to come out for a night of fun, just so I could sit at home with Dad and give Mom the impression I was the dependable daughter. Each time she would barely glance at me. "Stop trying so hard," she muttered once as I scrubbed dishes until my hands were raw. "It's embarrassing." Those words lodged in my chest like splinters. Embarrassing, I wanted to scream that everything I did was for her, for this family, for the fragile hope that she might one day say, "I'm proud of you, Emily." But instead, I bit my tongue, forcing myself to smile through the hurt. After all, maybe if I stayed patient and kept proving myself, she would finally see. Maybe if I was perfect enough, her eyes would soften just once. Sarah, meanwhile, basked in every drop of attention. She laughed loudly at dinner, reciting trivial stories from her day at work, and Mom hung on every word. "See, that's strength," she would say, nodding toward Sarah. "That's the kind of spirit this family needs." And there I sat silent, my father's quiet presence, the only thing keeping me from breaking down in tears. He never spoke against Mom. He was too tired, too worn down. But sometimes when she wasn't looking, he would squeeze my hand under the table. It was his way of saying he saw me even if no one else did. I tried to drown myself in studies, convincing myself that academic success would one day be my escape. Late nights in the library, early mornings at the tutoring center, endless hours spent proving to the world that I was capable. And yet when I returned home each weekend, that world collapsed into a smaller, harsher reality where all my accomplishments meant nothing. I was just the daughter who never measured up. Looking back, I wonder how I endured it as long as I did. Perhaps it was the stubborn hope that if I just tried harder, smiled brighter, gave more, eventually my mother would love me the way she loved Sarah. But no matter how perfectly I ironed the shirts, how carefully I seasoned the roast, how diligently I balanced my life between classes and caregiving, the praise never came. Only the cold stares, the dismissive comments, the gnawing silence that left me questioning my worth. I didn't know it then, but those years of invisibility and rejection were shaping me in ways I couldn't yet understand. They were sharpening my edges, toughening my resolve, preparing me for storms I never imagined would come. Because the truth was, my mother's cruelty wasn't just casual favoritism. It was deliberate. It had a purpose I had yet to uncover, one that would tear apart everything I thought I knew about love, family, and loyalty. But no matter what I did, it was never enough for her, and I was about to discover the devastating reason why. It was during one of those long autumn afternoons at Northwestern, when the leaves along Sheridan Road blazed red and gold, that I first met Alex. I was 22, worn down from balancing classes, tutoring shifts, and my endless responsibilities at home, and he seemed to appear out of nowhere like sunlight breaking through the gray. He was 24, a graduate student at the business school, tall with an easy smile that made people feel they were the only one in the room. I had never been the kind of girl who drew much attention, especially at home. But Alex noticed me right away. He sat next to me at a guest lecture about entrepreneurship, and before the end of the evening he had scribbled his number on the corner of my notebook. "We should keep talking," he said. "I think we have the same kind of dreams." From the very beginning, our conversations were different from anything I had ever known. Over coffee in the student union or late-night walks along Lake Michigan, we talked about building something of our own. One day, a company that would make a difference and prove to the world that two determined kids could create something extraordinary. He was ambitious but not arrogant, confident, but always eager to hear my ideas. When he said, "We'll conquer the world together, you and me," I almost believed it could be true. For once, I didn't feel like the overlooked daughter or the awkward outsider. I felt seen. As weeks turned into months, our lives began to weave together naturally. He would bring me sandwiches during long nights in the library, and I would quiz him before his finance exams. When I stressed over assignments, he calmed me with his quiet assurance, telling me, "You've got this, Emily. You always do." I had never had someone stand beside me so firmly, not just applauding my achievements, but holding me steady through the struggle to reach them. At home, every accomplishment was brushed aside or belittled, but with Alex, I felt as though each step forward mattered. With him, I wasn't invisible. I was cherished. Our relationship became a refuge. On weekends, when I could escape my mother's sharp words and my sister's smug smiles, Alex would take me out to the lake. We would sit on the rocks, our shoes off toes, skimming the cold water as the Chicago skyline glimmered in the distance. He would tell me about his childhood, about the small town in Indiana where he had grown up, about his determination to leave behind the limits he had known there. I told him about my father's quiet kindness, about my love for business strategy, about my secret dream to travel across Europe and see the world beyond the narrow streets of our suburb. He listened as though every word was precious. Sometimes when I fell silent, overwhelmed by how much it meant to finally be heard, he would take my hand and say, "Emily, you don't have to prove yourself to me. You already are everything." For the first time in my life, I let myself believe that love could be real. I no longer dreamed only of grades and survival. I dreamed of a future with Alex. We planned a little house with a porch where we could drink coffee on Sundays. We made lists of cities to visit: Paris, Rome, Barcelona, scribbled in the margins of our notebooks during class. I could picture us side by side, not just surviving but thriving, building a life that was ours alone. The idea of family no longer felt like a curse. With Alex, I thought I might finally know what it meant to belong. When senior year arrived, the pressure mounted. Final exams loomed, job applications piled up, and I felt stretched to my breaking point. But Alex was always there, steady as a rock. He walked me home from the library when the streets were dark, sat beside me as I drafted cover letters, and celebrated every small victory as though it were his own. He told me again and again, "We're a team, Emily, always." And I believed him. In his arms, I felt safe in a way I had never known before. All the bitterness from my mother's dismissals, all the loneliness of being the forgotten daughter, seemed to fade in the warmth of his love. Then came the night he surprised me. It was late spring, the air sweet with lilacs, and he asked me to meet him at our spot by the lake. When I arrived, he was standing there nervously, hands fidgeting in his jacket pocket. We talked for a few minutes, the way we always did, about finals and plans for the summer, and then he pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple silver ring, nothing extravagant, but it gleamed in the moonlight. "Emily," he said, his voice shaking, "I don't want to wait for life to happen to us. I want us to build it together. Will you marry me?" My breath caught tears, pricked my eyes, and I nodded before the words could even form. In that moment, every hurt, every dismissal, every lonely night at home seemed worth it, because here was someone who chose me, who loved me enough to want forever. We spent that night planning in broad strokes how after graduation we would have a modest church wedding, nothing flashy, just family and close friends. How we would start our life together, maybe in a small apartment near the city, scraping by at first, but happy because we had each other. For the first time, the future didn't terrify me. It exhilarated me. I clung to those plans like a lifeline. Each exam I passed, each job interview I prepared for, felt like a step toward the life I had dreamed of with him. I told myself that finally, I had escaped the shadow of my mother's cold eyes and my sister's smirks. I wasn't just the invisible daughter anymore. I was a woman who was loved, chosen, cherished. He would look at me sometimes, his eyes soft, and whisper, "You're my everything, Emily. You always will be." Those words wrapped around me like armor, shielding me from all the doubts and fears that had haunted me for years. I let myself believe in them, believe in him. He said I was his everything until my mother started whispering in his ear. After Alex slipped the simple ring on my finger and whispered his promises, I thought my life had finally begun to take shape. For the first time, I allowed myself to picture a future that wasn't marked by my mother's cutting remarks, or the way Sarah always seemed to shine brighter in her eyes. We began planning our modest church wedding, trading ideas about flowers and colors late into the night, and I felt a giddy kind of happiness I hadn't known since childhood. But soon the glow of engagement was interrupted by something far darker, something I had never anticipated: my mother's voice carrying through the thin walls of our home like a poison, seeping into everything I thought was safe. One evening I returned home earlier than expected from the library. As I passed the kitchen, I heard her low voice, sharp as a blade. "Alex, you need to think carefully about your future. She's too weak for a strong man like you. Sarah now. Sarah is a better wife and mother. She'll give you the life you deserve." I froze in the hallway, my hand trembling on the wall, unable to believe what I was hearing. My fiancé sat across from her silent, but I could feel the weight of his pause through the air. The humiliation stung even more than the words themselves. To my mother, I was not only unworthy of her love, but also of the man who had chosen me. I wanted to burst in to scream at her for daring to undermine me, but fear chained me to the shadows. I walked away quietly, telling myself that Alex loved me and that he would see through her manipulations. But her poison did not stop there. Over the next weeks, Sarah inserted herself into our wedding preparations with a brazenness that made my stomach turn. She showed up uninvited to meetings with the florist, laughing too loudly at Alex's jokes, her hand brushing his arm as though it belonged there. She offered to help with the decisions when I was busy with exams, her eyes glinting with that same smirk she had worn since we were children, when she'd snatch my toys, my clothes, and now apparently my future. She leaned into him when they bent over invitations, whispered things into his ear that made him smile uncomfortably, and every time I asked about it, she brushed me off with a falsely sweet, "I'm just trying to help, sis." What unsettled me most was Alex's shifting demeanor. At first he reassured me, kissing my forehead and telling me not to worry. But soon he began canceling plans. Our rehearsal dinner postponed because of work phone calls unanswered, with vague excuses about being too busy. His eyes, once steady when they met mine, now darted away with nervous energy, and when I reached for his hand, he often found some reason to pull away. I told myself it was just stress, that every groom feels nervous as the big day approaches, but the pit in my stomach grew heavier with each passing day. Meanwhile, Sarah grew more enthusiastic about every detail. She volunteered to pick up the cake samples, to meet with the photographer, to choose table settings when I couldn't make appointments. It was as though she were planning her own wedding. My mother watched her with pride, beaming at her initiative, while dismissing my concerns with a cold, "You should be grateful she cares enough to step in where you fall short." It was the same old narrative, only now it threatened to unravel the most important day of my life. Whenever I tried to confront Alex, he grew defensive, insisting that Sarah was just being helpful and that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something was slipping through my fingers. The tension mounted until I felt like a stranger in my own engagement. Friends asked about the wedding plans, and I smiled weakly, avoiding the truth that I no longer knew what was happening behind closed doors. Every time Sarah laughed too loudly at Alex's side, every time my mother's approving gaze lingered on them, a crack widened in the fragile foundation of my happiness. And yet I clung to hope, telling myself he loved me, that the ring on my finger meant something unshakable that no amount of whispers or sly smiles could take him from me. But then came the moment I could no longer deny. 3 days before the wedding, I walked into the bakery where I was supposed to finalize the order for our cake. And there they were, Sarah and Alex, their heads bent close together, laughing over samples of frosting, as if they were the bride and groom. My heart stopped cold, and in that instant, I realized they weren't planning my wedding anymore. The morning of my wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that should have promised happiness. My dress hung by the window, catching the sunlight as though it were glowing with promise. I should have felt like the luckiest woman in the world, ready to walk toward the man who once told me I was his everything. Instead, a hollow fear sat heavy in my stomach. The memory of Alex and Sarah laughing over cake samples still clung to me, though I tried to convince myself it was harmless, just my imagination twisting moments into nightmares. I clung to that hope as tightly as I held my bouquet. The church smelled faintly of roses and candle wax. Guests filled the pews, turning to watch as I stepped into the aisle. Their smiles felt like daggers because deep inside I feared this day might not unfold the way I had dreamed. But I pushed forward, each step echoing against the marble floor, telling myself Alex would be waiting at the altar. He had to be. Yet when I reached the front, the spot beside the pastor was empty. My breath caught. I stood there in my lace gown, every eye fixed on me, while silence crept through the room. The pastor cleared his throat and asked, "Where's the groom?" His voice cracked against the silence, each word striking me harder than the last. Minutes passed. Guests whispered, the sound rising like a storm. I scanned the church, searching desperately for Alex's face. My palms sweated against the stems of my bouquet, but still he did not appear. And then, from the back of the church, the heavy wooden doors creaked open. Gasps filled the sanctuary. Sarah stood in the doorway, dressed in white, her arm linked with Alex's. My sister's face shone with a triumphant smile, as if this were her day, not mine. Alex wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked straight ahead, pale but determined. "Sorry, everyone." Sarah called out, her voice clear and cruel, but Alex chose the right sister after all. The room erupted. Some guests gasped loudly, others whispered, and a few even laughed nervously as though it had to be some kind of sick performance. My knees nearly buckled beneath me. I clutched my bouquet so tightly the flowers bent and wilted under the pressure. I looked at Alex, pleading silently for him to correct her, to say this was a mistake. But he remained at her side, his silence screaming louder than any words could. And then my mother rose from her seat. She didn't look ashamed or embarrassed. She looked proud. Her voice rang through the church, cold and sharp. I convinced him to choose strength over weakness. Sarah will give him the life he deserves. Her words cut through me like a blade. My breath caught in my throat and the ground beneath me seemed to tilt. This was not just Alex's betrayal. It was my own mother, standing tall in her conviction, destroying me in front of everyone I loved and everyone who had come to celebrate me. I saw old friends hiding their faces and shock professors from my university, whispering behind hands, children pointing with wide, confused eyes. The humiliation was unbearable. My body felt frozen, my mind spinning as if I were trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. A deep, raw fury began to rise in my chest, but it was buried under layers of pain so sharp I could hardly breathe. This was supposed to be my beginning, my chance to step into a future of love and partnership. Instead, it was a stage for my family's betrayal. The weight of it pressed down on me, crushing and final, and there I remained, rooted in place, the picture of abandonment. My hands shook, my lips trembled, but I forced myself not to cry. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me collapse. Not yet. Not ever. I stood there in my wedding dress, abandoned at the altar, as my own family destroyed me in front of everyone I'd ever known. The moment Sarah's words echoed through the church, and my mother's voice rang out to confirm what they had plotted, my body finally moved. My bouquet slipped from my hands, petals scattering across the marble like pieces of a shattered life, and I turned on trembling legs. Gasps and whispers followed me as I pushed past the pews. I didn't look at anyone, not even the children who craned their necks to see the bride who had just been humiliated. The heavy doors slammed shut behind me, but their murmurs carried into the street, sticking to me like burrs I could never shake off. The cool air hit my face and I ran, my dress dragging behind me, the lace catching on cracks in the pavement. I didn't care. I just needed to be away from those eyes. Somewhere between the church steps and the corner, a camera flash nearly blinded me. A man I recognized from the local paper lifted his lens again. "Abandoned bride," he muttered with the excitement of someone who'd just found a front-page story. I shielded my face with my hands, but it was too late. By morning, the photo of me running through the streets in my wedding gown, tears streaking down my cheeks, would be everywhere. That image, I knew, would live longer than the marriage I had never been given. When I finally stumbled through the door of my childhood home, my chest burned with humiliation and rage. I tore the dress from my body, ripping stitches and scattering beads across the floor. The sound of fabric tearing was oddly satisfying, like shedding a skin I never wanted to wear again. Standing in my slip, I grabbed the old suitcase from the closet and began stuffing it with whatever I could find: jeans, sweaters, notebooks, anything that was mine and mine alone. My hands shook so badly that half the clothes tumbled to the floor, but I didn't stop. With every shirt I packed, I thought of Alex's silence. With every pair of shoes, I remembered Sarah's smirk. With every piece of myself I stuffed into that bag, I heard my mother's voice declaring me weak. I pulled open the desk drawer and found a piece of stationery. The pen hovered for a long time before the words spilled out in messy ink. "Dad, I'm leaving." I need to find out who I am without them. You know why. Don't look for me. Someday they'll regret what they've done." My throat tightened as I folded the note and placed it where I knew my father would see it first, on the kitchen table beside the half-finished crossword he worked on every night. For a moment I wanted to run to his room to tell him in person, but I couldn't bear to face the disappointment in his eyes, or worse, the pity. He deserved more than this broken daughter who couldn't even hold on to love. So I left the note and walked out carrying my suitcase and the weight of 1,000 unspoken screams. At the Greyhound station, I stood in line with strangers, my torn veil shoved deep in the suitcase like a secret I didn't want to carry, but couldn't bring myself to throw away. My fingers brushed the simple ring Alex had given me when he promised forever. I had slipped it off in the churchyard, but somehow it had ended up in my pocket. I turned it over in my palm, the metal cold and mocking a reminder of promises turned to ash. When I finally boarded the bus, the lights of my hometown flickered past the window as if mocking me with every memory I left behind. My reflection stared back at me pale and hollow-eyed, but behind the broken girl was something new, something harder. I clenched the ring in my fist so tightly the edges cut into my skin and swore to myself that this humiliation would not be the end of my story. It would be the beginning. 10 years. 10 years to rise from nothing, to build a life so strong they could never touch it to return, not as the abandoned bride, but as the woman who would make them beg for mercy. As the bus pulled away from my ruined wedding day, I made a promise that would take 10 years to fulfill, but would destroy them completely. Chicago greeted me with noise grit and a kind of indifference that cut deeper than words. The Greyhound hissed to a stop in the middle of the city, and I stepped off the bus with a suitcase that held the scraps of my old life and $200 folded into an envelope. That money, along with a few crumpled bills from forgotten wedding cards, was all I had left of the day that had ruined me. I told myself it would be enough. It had to be. I walked the streets in my scuffed shoes, overwhelmed by the crush of strangers and the endless honking of cars. The skyscrapers rose like judgmental sentinels above me, their glass faces reflecting a life I wasn't sure I would ever belong to. By nightfall, I found a moldy studio apartment on the south side for $350 a month. The smell of damp plaster greeted me as I unlocked the door, and a thin mattress on the floor was the only furniture. Still, it was mine. As I lay on the mattress that first night listening to sirens wail in the distance, I hugged my suitcase as if it could protect me from the world. The ache in my chest felt unbearable, but I whispered to myself, "This is where I begin again." The next morning, reality demanded more than promises. I needed a job, any job, to keep a roof over my head. I answered an ad in the newspaper and found myself behind the greasy counter of a fast food restaurant wearing a uniform that smelled of old oil. The manager barked orders with a voice that carried no patience. When I fumbled with the register, he sneered, "Faster, sweetheart. People don't have all day." Customers rolled their eyes when I took too long with their change, and one woman muttered loudly enough for me to hear, "Can't believe they hire girls like her." Shame burned my cheeks, but I forced my trembling hands to keep moving, handing out burgers and fries as though this humiliation was just another rung on the ladder I had to climb. During breaks, I sat on an upturned crate in the alley behind the restaurant, staring at the oil-stained pavement and wondering how far I had fallen. I thought of the altar, the whispers, the betrayal, and each memory struck like a slap. But instead of crumbling, I gritted my teeth and whispered, "This is only the beginning. Someday they'll choke on their laughter." The nights were the hardest. In my little apartment, shadows stretched long across the cracked walls, and the air reeked of mildew no matter how wide I opened the window. I would drift into uneasy sleep only to jolt awake, heart-pounding, as the same dream replayed me standing alone at the altar, the pastor's voice echoing, "Where is the groom?" Faces blurred together, laughing, judging, while Sarah stood smug beside Alex. I woke with tears soaking my pillow, gasping for air, like I was drowning in that church again. But instead of letting the nightmares break me, I used them. I bought a cheap spiral notebook from the corner store and began filling its pages. At first, I wrote simple sentences: get a better job, save money, don't trust anyone. Then the words grew sharper, bolder, like weapons taking shape. Become someone they can't ignore. Build a life so big they choke on it. Return stronger than anyone expects. Every night after scrubbing fast food grease from my hair and hands, I sat by the flickering light of a lamp that hummed like it was ready to die and wrote until my wrist ached. My tears smudged the ink, but I didn't care. Those words were the only things holding me together. Each page was a promise that I would not remain the abandoned bride forever. Out in the city, no one knew my name. No one cared that I had once been humiliated in front of 100 people, that my face had been plastered across the local paper with the cruel headline, "Left at the altar." Here I was, just another tired young woman serving burgers, another shadow moving through crowded streets. And maybe that anonymity was my salvation. They had erased me from their lives. Now I would erase the weak version of myself. In her place, I would create someone unrecognizable, someone unstoppable. I didn't know it yet, but this brutal city was about to forge me into someone they'd never recognize. The first month in Chicago drained me more quickly than I expected. My $200 had vanished almost overnight, swallowed by rent, a security deposit, and a few groceries that didn't last a week. I stared at my empty cupboards and counted the bills in my wallet, not enough for both food and rent. I knew what I had to choose. Rent kept a roof over my head. Food could wait. So I skipped meals, telling myself I wasn't hungry, drinking water until my stomach ached. The first day I felt lightheaded but managed to push through. The second day I nearly collapsed while scrubbing trays at the fast food restaurant, the smell of fries taunting me until I wanted to scream. My body grew weaker, but strangely my resolve sharpened. Every pang of hunger became a reminder that I was paying the price for survival now, so I could collect my reward later. It was my silent rebellion, proof that I could endure what others would never dare. Still, one job wasn't enough. The rent swallowed most of my paycheck, and the little left couldn't stretch far enough. So I took on more. By day, I worked as a waitress in a dingy diner, carrying plates of greasy eggs and burnt coffee to truckers and construction workers who tipped only when they felt like it. At night, I pulled on rubber gloves and scrubbed office floors until my back screamed and my hands stung from bleach. On weekends, I stood for hours behind a cash register at a retail shop, folding clothes that I couldn't dream of buying. My life became a cycle of uniforms and aching feet, of alarm clocks ringing before dawn and falling into bed just before sunrise, only to do it all again. The exhaustion was bone deep. Some nights, while mopping endless rows of linoleum in quiet, empty offices, my body would give out. I fainted once, waking on the cold floor with my mop still in hand, the bitter taste of bleach in my throat. Instead of feeling fear, I laughed bitterly. If I could collapse and still rise again, then I was stronger than I ever believed. Every hour of pain, I told myself, was an investment. Every blister, every drop of sweat was a down payment on the empire I promised myself I would build. When my body cried for rest, I silenced it with the reminder Sarah had taken Alex. Mother had called me weak and the world had laughed. That humiliation was fuel, and I refused to let it burn out. I learned quickly that survival wasn't just about working harder. It was about discipline. I stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. No new clothes, no makeup, no small comforts to soften the harshness of my days. I carried my lunch in a paper bag, bread, maybe an apple if I could find one cheap enough at the corner store. I tracked every penny in a small notebook, tallying columns late at night until my vision blurred. If I had 50 cents left at the end of the week, I considered it a victory. Some weeks I cried while writing the numbers, my stomach twisting in hunger as I stared at totals that never seemed to add up. But those tears dried, quickly replaced by a grim determination. I promised myself I would never again let money or the lack of it define my worth. Over time, those small sacrifices became habits. I realized that every dollar I didn't spend was a step toward freedom. I began to see patterns in my struggles, lessons, hiding within the misery. Hunger taught me how to endure. Exhaustion taught me how to push through limits I once thought impossible. Budgeting taught me how to plan with precision, how to stretch small resources into something larger. These weren't just survival tactics. They were tools I would someday wield to build a future strong enough to crush the past. Poverty was my teacher, and though cruel, it was effective. Each hardship shaped me into something sharper, stronger, more unyielding than I ever thought possible. Still, there were nights when I broke down, when I curled up on the thin mattress in my moldy apartment and sobbed into my pillow until the fabric was damp. I thought about the life I should have had, the wedding I was robbed of, the love I was promised, the family that betrayed me. Those tears might have weakened me once, but now they were part of the process. Every time I wiped my face and stood again, I felt a flicker of pride. I hadn't quit. I hadn't gone crawling back. I was still standing, even if barely. And one day I would stand taller than them all. The city itself seemed to conspire against me, testing me at every turn. Winters froze me to the bone as I walked home from late shifts, boots soaked through with slush, fingers numb as I fumbled for my keys. Summers baked the tiny apartment until I could barely breathe, the broken fan rattling uselessly on the dresser. Yet no matter what the city threw at me, I endured. I became a creature of survival, learning to bend but never break. Each challenge, each sleepless night, each pang of hunger was proof that I was becoming something unrecognizable to the girl who once stood at the altar, waiting for love that never came. I told myself every morning that this suffering had an expiration date. 10 years. That vow was carved into my bones. Every greasy plate, every mop stroke, every dollar saved was another brick in the foundation of my revenge. I clung to that vision when my body cried for rest, when my heart ached with loneliness. I imagined the day I would return not as the abandoned bride they had mocked, but as someone powerful enough to make them bow their heads in shame. And then one late night while scrubbing executive floors, I met the woman who would teach me how to turn rage into riches. The night I met her began like so many others, with my body aching and my mind drifting into the dull rhythm of survival. It was after midnight, and I was bent over a bucket of soapy water on the 22nd floor of a gleaming downtown tower, scrubbing the marble tiles until my reflection blurred beneath me. My arms felt heavy. My back screamed from bending, but I kept moving because the rent was due in 3 days, and I couldn't afford to slow down. The office lights glowed harshly, every corner, polished and perfect, mocking the cracks and stains of my own life. I thought I was alone, just another invisible cleaner in a city filled with ghosts, until I heard the click of high heels on the marble. I froze, mop in hand, embarrassed to be caught in my sweat-stained uniform. When I looked up, I saw her. She was elegant, dressed in a navy suit with pearls glinting at her throat, her silver hair swept back neatly. She looked every inch the kind of woman who belonged in this building, not someone who bent over floors like me. She stopped, tilted her head, and said, "You work hard for someone so young. What's your story?" No one had ever asked me that before. The question startled me more than her presence. I stammered something about needing the money, about holding down 3 jobs. She studied me for a long moment, then smiled in a way that felt oddly kind. "Come downstairs with me," she said. "There's a 24-hour diner around the corner. You need coffee more than you need that mop tonight." I hesitated, suspicious of her sudden interest, but something in her voice carried authority that was impossible to ignore. At the diner, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and a chipped mug warming my hands, she introduced herself as Elena. She told me she owned several businesses across Chicago, built from the ground up after her husband died when she was in her 30s. A self-made widow, she called herself, with a touch of pride. Then, almost casually, she leaned forward and said, "But before all of that, I was betrayed by my own sister. She stole my first fiancé." My breath caught. The words sank deep, echoing my own pain so precisely it was as if she had reached into my chest and plucked out the wound I tried to hide. She went on describing the way her sister charmed the man she was supposed to marry, the way her mother encouraged it, insisting he would be happier with someone stronger. My hands trembled around the mug. It was my story spoken from another mouth only decades earlier. For the first time since my own wedding day disaster, I felt understood. Elena didn't flinch when I told her about Alex, about Sarah, about my mother standing in that church and declaring me weak. She didn't pity me either. Instead, she looked me in the eye and said, "Your fury is raw power. You can let it eat you alive, or you can sharpen it into a weapon. Which will you choose?" No one had ever framed it that way before. I had been drowning in anger, but hearing her speak, I realized that maybe anger could be the thing that saved me. That night marked the beginning of something new. Elena insisted we meet once a week. I thought she might forget, but the very next Tuesday she was waiting outside my apartment in her black sedan, honking softly as if she'd done it 100 times before. She took me to her office, poured me tea in a porcelain cup that looked too delicate for my rough hands, and began teaching me lessons I had never expected to learn. She explained profit margins and overhead costs, how to read a balance sheet, how to recognize when someone was lying in a contract. At first, the numbers overwhelmed me, but Elena had patience. She broke everything down into small steps, showing me how every business, no matter how large, was built from the same foundation. More than the technical skills, though, she taught me confidence. "You walk into a room as if you belong there," she said one evening when I shrank back during a meeting with one of her managers. "People believe what you project. If you project weakness, they will eat you alive. If you project strength, they will serve you even if you're trembling inside." I began to practice in the mirror, holding my shoulders back, lifting my chin, forcing myself to meet my own gaze. The girl who once ran from a church in tears began to fade, replaced by a woman who stared herself down and refused to blink. Week by week, the lessons grew sharper. Elena told me stories of ruthless negotiations of competitors who tried to crush her and failed, of nights she spent crying but still showed up the next morning ready to fight. She didn't sugarcoat anything. "Business is war," she said. "You win or you die. But sometimes, victory is simply refusing to quit." Something in me responded to that truth. I felt the predator instincts, awakening instincts I had never allowed myself to acknowledge because I had been taught to stay small, to accept scraps of approval while others feasted. With Elena's guidance, I began to imagine more than survival. I began to imagine power. I started small, practicing the budgeting skills I had learned out of desperation, but this time with a strategy. I set goals, tracked progress, and found ways to save even more. Elena praised my discipline, telling me it was the foundation of every empire. For the first time, I saw myself not as a victim of betrayal, but as someone sharpening her claws, preparing for the day she would strike back. The nights of hunger and exhaustion had hardened me. Elena's mentorship was now shaping me, giving me direction. I left her office after each session with my heart pounding and my mind blazing with possibilities. The world that had once chewed me up suddenly looked like prey. My past had stripped me bare, but Elena was teaching me how to use that naked pain as armor, as fuel, as a weapon. Her words didn't just inspire me, they taught me that the best revenge is building an empire they can never touch. When Elena handed me that first $500, it felt like someone had given me the key to a door I'd been pounding on for years. It wasn't much, but in my world it was a fortune. Every cent mattered, every dollar carried the weight of both hope and risk. I told myself I would make it stretch into something real, something bigger than the crumbling apartment I slept in, or the fast food grease that clung to my hair after night shifts. I had no illusions about how hard it would be, but I carried Elena's words in my chest like armor. "Your fury is raw power. Use it." I decided I would use that fury to build. My first step was small but daring, an event planning service. I figured who better than someone like me who had spent years observing every detail of other people's celebrations while serving from the sidelines to know what could make an event memorable. I designed a flyer on an ancient computer at the public library, printed 20 copies, and walked the city streets in the biting cold, slipping them under coffee shop bulletin boards, laundromat corkboards, and church community boards. To my surprise, within a week, a young couple called me. They wanted help planning their engagement party, something simple but elegant. My heart soared. Finally, a real chance. I threw myself into the job with every ounce of energy I had, convincing myself that if I could make this work, word of mouth would spread, and I would never have to scrub office floors again. The couple trusted me enough to hand over a deposit, and I felt so proud walking into the florist shop with cash in hand. The supplier was a man in his 50s, friendly enough, promising to deliver the arrangements on the day of the party. I shook his hand, believing I'd taken my first step into professional respectability. But when the day came, no flowers arrived. I called the number he'd given me disconnected. I ran to the shop only to find the door locked and a handwritten "For Rent" sign taped to the window. My stomach dropped, the blood rushing to my ears until I could barely hear my own thoughts. I had been conned. I had to show up to the engagement party empty-handed, face the couple, and explain. Their disappointment cut deeper than any knife. The party was salvaged with last-minute decorations, but I could see the bride-to-be's tight smile, her eyes flicking to me with judgment. I left the event with humiliation pressing down on me, heavier than the mop bucket I used to push around. I cried that night until my chest hurt, but I learned something I would never forget. Trust had to be earned, contracts had to be written, and optimism could be the sharpest blade turned against you. Elena didn't scold me. Instead, she said, "Good. Better to be burned for 500 than 5 million. Now you know the stakes." She made me sit down and draft a mock contract right there in her kitchen, teaching me how to spell out terms that couldn't be twisted. Failure, she reminded me, was tuition for the education the world wasn't generous enough to give for free. Her words steadied me, but I still felt hollow. The world was bigger and harsher than I'd realized, and I wasn't sure how many more times I could scrape myself off the pavement. One evening, not long after that disaster, I was back at my restaurant shift. It was late, the dinner rush had thinned, and I was wiping down tables when I heard a voice say my name in disbelief. I turned, rag still in hand, and saw Jennifer. My Jennifer from college. From the days when life still felt like a map of possibilities instead of a battlefield. She looked almost the same, though sharper around the edges, her business attire tailored and sleek, her hair perfectly blown out. "Oh my God, Emily, is it really you?" she said, her eyes wide. For a second, shame washed over me. I wanted to disappear into the sticky floor to hide my grease-stained apron and the exhaustion in my eyes. But Jennifer rushed to hug me, holding me like no time had passed. She insisted on sitting in my section, and as I served her a plate of pasta, she asked everything, where I'd been, what had happened. I told her bits and pieces, careful not to spill the full humiliation of my wedding day, but she saw enough in my eyes to know it hadn't been easy. When I mentioned trying to start an event business, her face lit up. "That's perfect for you," she said. "You were always the organized one. I still remember how you basically ran our student gala while the rest of us floundered." She pulled a business card from her purse and pressed it into my hand. "Call me. I know people who need reliable planners. You just need the right introductions." That card felt heavier than gold. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like the universe hadn't completely forgotten me. We talked until her dinner was cold, laughing about old professors remembering stupid inside jokes. For a little while, I wasn't the abandoned bride or the desperate waitress. I was just Emily again, with someone who remembered me when I was still whole. Before she left, she tilted her head thoughtfully. "This is random, but it just popped into my head," she said. "Years ago, I was in the admin office at Northwestern sorting out some paperwork. I swear I saw your mom there looking frantic. She was asking all these questions about your student records, even your birth certificate. It seemed odd at the time, but I didn't think much of it." She shrugged. "I only remembered because, well, I always thought your mom treated you kind of strangely." Her words sent a chill through me. my mother at the university, my records, my birth certificate. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Jennifer just smiled and squeezed my arm before walking out into the night heels, clicking confidently against the tile. I stood there with her card clutched in my hand, torn between gratitude and unease. She said my mother had been asking questions about my birth certificate, but I was too focused on survival to understand what that meant. The weeks after Jennifer's unexpected visit blurred together in a mix of exhaustion and hope. She had left me with a business card and a promise that she knew people who needed someone dependable, someone who could make things happen even on a tight budget. I almost didn't call her, afraid that I'd embarrass myself or fail again, but one night after wiping down tables in the diner until my back screamed, I pulled that card out of my pocket and dialed. Jennifer answered as though she had been waiting for me. Within minutes, she was telling me about a family she worked with who hosted charity galas every year and had been frustrated by a string of unreliable event planners. "Emily, this could be your shot," she said, her voice warm and certain, as though she could already see me succeeding where I only saw risk. I barely slept the night before the meeting. My entire future seemed to rest on whether or not I could convince this family to take a chance on me, a woman with no real business, just a dream, a binder full of notes, and the conviction that I would not fail again. I borrowed a blazer from a coworker at the diner, pressed it with an old iron until the sleeves looked presentable, and rehearsed my pitch on the bus ride over. My hands shook as I waited in the marble lobby of their downtown building, surrounded by people in tailored suits who looked as though they belonged there in a way I did not. But when the family's representative finally walked in, I forced myself to smile and introduced myself as confidently as I could. The meeting was grueling, filled with skeptical questions about budget management and vendor contracts. But somewhere in the middle, something shifted. I explained how I could pull together resources others overlooked, how my own struggles had taught me to stretch every dollar without sacrificing quality, and I saw the man's expression change from doubt to cautious interest. By the time we shook hands, he said, "Let's see what you can do with this year's gala." It wasn't a promise of success, but it was an opening, and to me, it felt like the world had tilted in my favor for the first time in years. Those next weeks were some of the hardest of my life. I negotiated with vendors who didn't take me seriously, begged for small discounts, and convinced a local florist to extend credit in exchange for a promise of future business. I barely slept. But on the night of the gala, as the lights dimmed and the music swelled, everything fell into place. Guests arrived in glittering gowns and crisp tuxedos, admiring the elegant decorations and perfectly coordinated service. I moved quietly in the background, making sure every detail held together, but inside my chest swelled with pride. When the family approached me afterward, shaking my hand and saying, "You've outdone yourself, Emily. We want you again next year," I nearly cried. My first real income, enough not just to pay the rent, but to breathe for the first time in months, came from that night. With the payment from the gala, I made my first bold decision. I placed an ad for part-time help, not because I could truly afford it yet, but because I knew I couldn't grow alone. 2 women answered, both single mothers struggling to make ends meet, both eager for steady hours, even if the pay was modest. Their gratitude and determination reminded me of myself, and when they joined me, I realized that building something wasn't just about climbing out of poverty, it was about pulling others up with me. Together we operated out of a cramped office space I rented above a laundromat, but to me it might as well have been a corner suite overlooking the Chicago River. Word spread quickly. The gala had given me credibility, and soon small corporate events, birthdays, and fundraisers began trickling in. Clients admired the professionalism of my little team, the way we handled setbacks with calm and creativity. For the first time, my days weren't consumed by dread of bills or the humiliation of scrubbing floors. I was building a reputation brick by brick, and though the foundation was small, it was strong. Then one afternoon, Jennifer burst into the office with a folded magazine in her hands. She tossed it onto my desk, and there on the cover was my face framed by a headline that read, "Rising Star Under 30, From Struggles to Success in Chicago's Event World." I stared at it, unable to believe it was real. The article told my story, not all of it, not the heartbreak and betrayal I kept locked inside, but enough of it to inspire readers who only saw a young woman making her way against the odds. My employees hugged me, their eyes shining with pride, and I framed the article on the wall above my desk where I could see it every morning when I walked in. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to breathe in the sweetness of accomplishment. I had been nothing but a broken girl in a torn wedding dress, once running from whispers and humiliation. Now I was a name in print, a woman who had made her first real mark. Still, as I stared at that frame, I felt a stirring deep inside, a reminder that this was only the beginning. The taste of success was intoxicating, but it was not enough. Not yet. Success tasted sweet, but I was just getting started on my climb to the top. 5 years passed, and when I think back to the girl I was when I stepped off that bus in Chicago, hungry and terrified, I hardly recognize her. That morning began like many others lately. I unlocked the door to my downtown office, sunlight pouring through tall glass windows onto polished hardwood floors. I set my bag down on the leather chair behind my desk and glanced at the framed article still hanging on the wall, the one that had first called me a rising star. But now it felt almost quaint. I had outgrown that article, outgrown even the words rising star. I was no longer rising. I had risen. There was a large mirror mounted across from my desk, a decorative piece meant for clients to check their appearance before stepping into big events. As I adjusted my jacket, I caught sight of myself in it. A tailored navy suit hugged my frame, the kind of garment I used to only dream about. My hair was neat, my makeup polished, my heels clicked with authority across the floor. I leaned closer, studying the reflection. I did not see the abandoned bride from the altar anymore, nor the exhausted waitress dragging herself through double shifts. I saw a woman who had rebuilt herself from rubble, who carried herself with confidence not borrowed from anyone else's approval, but carved out of her own survival. I walked the office, letting my eyes fall on the signs of what I had created. Rows of binders documenting past events lined the shelves, each one proof of contracts fulfilled and clients who trusted me. My assistant was already fielding calls from new inquiries, corporate galas, weddings for the city's elite charity fundraisers that needed flawless execution. What began as a desperate attempt to prove myself had grown into one of Chicago's most sought-after event planning firms. We had moved 3 times in 5 years, each office bigger than the last, and now we occupied an entire floor. But my business was not the only thing that had flourished. With Elena's advice, I began investing early, putting money into small properties in struggling neighborhoods. Those properties grew in value, and suddenly I had a second source of income, steady and reliable. The girl who once had to choose between rent and food now signed checks for mortgages, contractors, and development projects. I had friends in places I once thought untouchable, city officials who attended my events, local philanthropists who called me personally, fellow entrepreneurs who asked for my advice. I had built a network as sturdy as the walls around me, a life my mother and sister could never erase. Still, no matter how many deals I signed or articles I framed, there were moments late at night when I remembered that day in the church. The sting of standing there in white while whispers filled the air never fully left me, though it no longer controlled me. If anything, it fueled me. Every time I closed a contract or deposited a payment, I thought of the faces of those who had once smirked at my pain. Their betrayal had become the foundation of everything I had now. One evening, I sat at my desk long after my employees had gone home. The city lights glittered outside the window, and I opened the small wooden box I kept in the bottom drawer. Inside were old photographs and a few tokens of the life I'd left behind. I pulled out one picture of Alex and me during our college days, both of us smiling as though the future was certain. My stomach tightened, not with longing, but with disbelief at how far I had come from that girl who thought love alone would save her. With steady hands, I placed the picture into the shredder and watched it disappear. Then I deleted the last digital traces I still carried on my phone contacts, old messages, photos I had never quite been ready to erase. When the screen went blank, I felt something I hadn't in years: lightness. It was as though chains I hadn't realized I was dragging had finally been cut. I whispered to the empty office. Now I'm ready. Not for them. Not for what I lost. For what I deserve. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. I imagined the life I wanted now, one not haunted by betrayal, but strengthened by what I had built. I thought about companionship, not the kind where I clung to someone for validation, but the kind where two people stood side by side as equals. I knew I was ready for that now. I no longer needed someone to rescue me. I had rescued myself. Whoever came into my life next would have to meet me where I stood on solid ground of my own making. For the first time, the thought of love didn't scare me. It excited me. I felt I could open my heart again, not to repeat the past, but to write something entirely new. I smiled at my reflection in the mirror across the office, the confident woman staring back at me. She was whole. She was strong. And she was no longer waiting for anyone's permission to live fully. I thought I had left my past behind forever, until fate brought someone into my life who would change everything. The night of the Chicago Business Excellence Awards felt like a culmination of every sleepless night and every sacrifice I had made. The ballroom shimmered with light crystal chandeliers, casting a glow over gowns and tuxedos that glittered like jewels. I had been invited to give a keynote speech, a moment that only 5 years ago would have felt impossible. My topic was resilience, framed around my journey of building an empire from the ashes of humiliation and despair. As I stood at the podium, my voice carried steady and clear, and for once I wasn't just telling a story, I was living proof of it. When the applause filled the room at the end of my speech, I felt the kind of validation I used to dream of, but never dared believe was real. As I stepped off the stage, glass of sparkling water in hand, people approached me to offer congratulations. Their words blurred together polite admiration and handshakes. But one figure lingered, waiting until the crowd had thinned. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that somehow didn't wear him. He wore it. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, his jawline sharp, his presence commanding without trying. He extended his hand, and when our eyes met, it felt like he was seeing straight past the public figure I'd carefully constructed, and directly into me. "You have fire that burns brighter than most," he said, his voice low, steady, deliberate. "Most people in this room, they've built businesses out of money, out of privilege. You built yours out of survival. That's rarer and far more powerful." For a moment I was taken aback. Compliments were nothing new in this world, but his words weren't flattery. They were observation. He had read something in me others overlooked, something I guarded as both my wound and my strength. I found myself smiling despite the instinct to remain guarded. "Thank you." I suppose the fire was the only thing I had left to keep me warm. He smiled then, faintly, almost as if he understood more than I had said. "That kind of fire doesn't just keep you warm. It lights the path for others." We stood in silence for a beat, the hum of conversation and clinking glasses filling the space around us. Then he introduced himself. David, just David for tonight." I laughed, lightly intrigued by the evasiveness. "Just David. No last name." "Not yet," he replied, his eyes holding mine with a glimmer that was both playful and unreadable. Some stories deserve to unfold slowly. Something in the way he said it sent a chill down my spine, not of fear, but of recognition. As though the universe was whispering that this encounter meant more than I could yet see. We drifted into conversation, and to my surprise, it flowed as easily as if we'd known each other for years. We spoke about business, yes, but not in the usual transactional way. He asked about my philosophy, how I made decisions, what I valued most in building not just a company, but a legacy. I told him about trust, about how betrayal had once nearly destroyed me, but had also taught me that character mattered more than anything else. He listened intently, not interrupting, not trying to impress me with his own accomplishments. Instead, he leaned in, genuinely curious. When I asked about his work, he gave only pieces, fragments. "I've built companies, sold some, kept others. I've invested in people more than products. Money comes and goes, the right people last. He mentioned growing up in a small Illinois town, one I vaguely remembered hearing of but couldn't place on a map. But when I pressed for more details, family, childhood, how he came to the city, he shifted smoothly, changing the subject back to me. It should have been frustrating, but instead, it only deepened the air of mystery surrounding him. The evening slipped away, as if time bent around us. The noise of the gala faded into the background, the swirling gowns and tuxedos, nothing more than shadows. As we stood near the edge of the room, our glasses untouched, our conversation weaving through dreams and philosophies, fears and hopes. I caught myself laughing in a way I hadn't in years, a sound unburdened, free. It startled me. I had become so used to holding myself together, to projecting strength, that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to simply be seen without effort. At one point, he tilted his head, studying me in that same unsettling but oddly comforting way. "You remind me of someone who walks through fire and comes out stronger instead of burned." I swallowed the words, landing in the tender space of memory where the ashes of my wedding day still lingered. "I suppose I had no other choice," I said softly. "There's always a choice." He countered, his gaze steady. "You chose not to let it define you. That's what makes you extraordinary." Extraordinary. Not broken, not abandoned, not a victim. The word wrapped around me like a balm, and I realized how long it had been since anyone had called me something without attaching it to pity or condescension. The night wound down, guests began to leave, and the hum of conversation faded into the quiet of the near-empty ballroom. He glanced around as though measuring the moment, then looked back at me. His expression softened, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. "I'd like to continue this conversation. Over dinner, perhaps, or somewhere less crowded." For the first time in a long time, my pulse quickened, not from anxiety or dread, but from possibility. There was a gravity in him, something dangerous in its pull, but also something that felt unshakably right. He reached into his pocket, not for a business card like the dozens I had collected that evening, but simply extended his hand again, palm open, waiting. "Can I have your number?" He asked for my number, and something about his eyes made me feel like fate was finally smiling on me. The first dinner with David after the gala was simple, almost disarmingly so. He chose a quiet Italian restaurant tucked into a side street where the lighting was soft and the tables close enough for conversation to feel intimate. I arrived with my guard firmly in place, reminding myself again and again that I couldn't allow history to repeat itself. I told myself this was just dinner, just conversation, nothing more. Still, I caught myself smoothing my hair in the reflection of the restaurant's window, before walking in my heart, betraying my calm facade. When he stood to greet me, his expression was calm without expectation, and it made me feel less like I was stepping into a trap, and more like I was stepping into something gently unknown. We ordered food and wine, and as we ate, he asked questions. Not the shallow kind, not inquiries designed to impress, but genuine questions about my work, about how I managed stress, about what I loved most about building something of my own. I answered cautiously, giving pieces of myself, but never the whole story. I mentioned that I knew betrayal well, but I did not explain how it had gutted me on my wedding day. I told him I understood the pain of having family let you down, but I didn't describe the hollow laughter of my mother and sister as they tore my world apart. My words were guarded like stones laid into a wall, protecting me from the possibility of being hurt again. David never pressed. Instead, he offered glimpses of his own past, carefully measured, almost as if he knew how much I could bear at once. "My family was destroyed by cruel people years ago," he said once, his voice even, but laced with something darker underneath. "It taught me that not everyone deserves your trust." He left it at that, and when I tilted my head silently asking for more, he shook it off with a faint smile. "Another time." It should have frustrated me, but instead it drew me in because he seemed to understand the language of scars without needing to compare them directly. Weeks passed, and with each meeting, coffee dinner, the occasional long walk through the city, I found myself lowering my defenses, if only an inch at a time. He never demanded more than I was ready to give. He didn't ask why certain memories tightened my throat, or why I sometimes looked away when weddings came up in conversation. He simply stayed steady and unshaken, proving himself in small, quiet ways. He attended one of my company's events not as a guest, but as a silent supporter, slipping into the back and watching the evening unfold. Later, he told me it was flawless, but what struck me more than his words was that he hadn't announced himself, hadn't tried to use his presence to add weight to the evening. He was content to let me shine. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself sitting in my office, exhausted after a particularly demanding week. Papers littered my desk, my inbox overflowed, and I was seconds from snapping when my phone buzzed. It was David. "Step outside." The message read, "Curious." I went downstairs, and there he was standing with 2 paper cups of coffee and a small bag of pastries. "You need to breathe," he said simply, handing me one of the cups. No judgment, no lecture, just presence. That was how he won me, not with grand gestures, but with consistency, with showing up in ways that others never had. Still, the wall around me remained. I was careful. I told myself every night that I couldn't trust too easily, that I couldn't afford to let someone in who might one day see my weaknesses and decide like Alex had that I wasn't worth choosing. My heart had windows now, but they were shuttered, letting only slivers of light through. Then came the night of the thunderstorm. The city was cloaked in sheets of rain, the streets slick and shining under bursts of lightning. We had been walking near the river when the storm broke, and instead of running for cover, David laughed, tilting his face up to the sky as though welcoming it. We ducked into a narrow awning, water dripping from our coats, our hair plastered to our faces. I was laughing too breathless, and for a moment I forgot to be guarded. He turned to me, then his expression suddenly serious. The laughter faded from his lips, and he reached out, brushing a wet strand of hair from my cheek. His hand lingered, steady, grounding. "Emily," he said, and the way he spoke my name carried a weight that stilled me. "I don't need to know every detail of your past. I don't need explanations or justifications. I choose you for exactly who you are right now, standing here in the rain with me." The words pierced through me with the force of lightning itself. No one had ever said that to me, not without conditions or comparisons. My mother had always measured me against Sarah. Alex had measured me against my own sister and found me lacking. But David in that moment was telling me I was enough. Not because of what I had built, not because of the empire I now commanded, but simply because I was me. I felt the wall around my heart crack just slightly, a window opening where none had been before. My throat tightened, and for a long moment I couldn't speak. The rain poured around us, but inside that narrow awning I felt something shift, something fragile but undeniable. His words broke through walls I'd built around my heart, but I had no idea how deeply our pasts were already intertwined. After that night in the storm, something shifted between David and me. It wasn't dramatic. No fireworks or sudden declarations, but a steady opening of doors I had kept locked for too long. Where I once hesitated, I began to lean. Where I once doubted, I began to trust. That trust first showed itself not in candlelit dinners or whispered confessions, but in the boardroom surrounded by contracts and spreadsheets. My company had grown steadily over the years, but I had always played it safe, wary of extending too far. David saw beyond my caution. One evening, while reviewing proposals in my office, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You've built the bones of an empire. Now it's time to flesh it out." I laughed nervously, admitting my reluctance to take on large investments. He didn't dismiss my fears or brush them aside. Instead, he asked me to show him the numbers, to walk him through my plans. For the first time, I had someone who listened, not to undermine but to understand. Together, we mapped out a vision of expansion, moving beyond mid-size events into the world of luxury experiences that catered to Chicago's elite. David offered capital to fuel the growth, but he made it clear, "This is your company, Emily. I'm not here to take control. I'm here to back the best mind I've ever seen." The first time he attended a meeting with my potential investors, I braced myself for the old pattern, the expectation that a man's voice would overshadow mine. But as soon as one of the investors directed a question at him, David smiled and gestured toward me. "She's the visionary here. I'm just lucky to support her." His words disarmed the room. All eyes turned to me not with condescension, but with respect. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I had spent so much of my life being spoken over, dismissed, or replaced that I almost didn't know how to stand in the center of the stage. But David's unwavering gaze grounded me, and I found myself speaking with confidence I didn't realize I had been waiting to use. By the end of that meeting, not only had the investors agreed to back the expansion, but they also approached me afterward praising my clarity and vision. I walked out of that room taller than I had walked in, not because David gave me power, but because he had cleared space for me to claim it myself. As months passed, our business and our relationship grew in tandem. There were late nights when we pored over floor plans, choosing the location for a new flagship office. There were mornings when we shared coffee while reviewing vendor contracts, my notes scribbled in the margins while his neat handwriting filled the spaces I'd missed. We debated sometimes passionately over details, whether to invest in in-house catering or continue outsourcing, whether to prioritize expansion in Chicago or look toward the coasts. But unlike past arguments in my life, these discussions never left me feeling small. With David, disagreement was collaboration. He respected my instincts, and when I was wrong, he corrected me gently with evidence and patience rather than mockery or dismissal. It was the kind of partnership I had once thought existed only in stories. One weekend, after months of back-to-back events and endless work, David suggested we escape the city. He drove us north to Wisconsin, where the air smelled of pine and the lake stretched wide and calm. We stayed in a cozy lodge, its walls lined with old photographs of fishermen and families long gone. The pace was slower there, and for the first time in years, I let myself relax. We spent mornings walking wooded trails, afternoons sitting by the water, and evenings in front of a crackling fire. I remember one night in particular. We had burned a tray of marshmallows, spectacularly turning them into blackened lumps that neither of us dared taste. I laughed so hard my sides hurt, and David leaned back, watching me with an expression so warm, so unguarded that it silenced my laughter into a quiet smile. "This," he said softly, "is what it should feel like." We talked long into the night about dreams not tied to profit margins or event calendars. He told me about wanting a home filled with laughter where no one feared walking through the door. I admitted that for so long I had wanted success only to prove myself to silence the voices that told me I wasn't enough. But sitting there, I realized success had given me something more precious: the chance to choose a partner who valued me as an equal. In the flicker of firelight, I saw not just the man who had helped me expand my business, but the man who had anchored me, who had shown me that strength didn't have to mean standing alone. When we returned to Chicago, the world felt sharper, brighter. Investors respected me not just because I was competent, but because David made sure they saw me as the leader. My employees worked harder, inspired by the culture we were building together, one rooted in fairness, ambition, and trust. Every corner of my life felt transformed. The broken bride who had fled in humiliation was gone, replaced by a woman who not only commanded respect, but had someone beside her who celebrated her victories as much as she celebrated her own. It wasn't just love I'd found my partner in building the life I'd always dreamed of. The first time David hinted at proposing it wasn't with words but with the way he looked at me. We had been walking along Lake Michigan, the same stretch of water where Alex once whispered promises that turned to ash in my hands. But with David, the air felt different, steady, unshakable. His hand was warm around mine, and the silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of something I could only describe as peace. When he finally stopped and turned to face me, the lake shimmering gold with the setting sun behind him, I felt my breath catch. He didn't kneel, not at first. He just held both of my hands in his and said in a voice steady and sure, "You're my future, my peace, the reason I believe in tomorrow again." Then he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside lay a vintage ring, delicate and timeless, with a round diamond set in an intricate band of white gold. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said softly. his voice trembling for the first time. She believed in love that could survive wars, betrayals, and even death. I want you to wear it, because I know you and I are meant to survive everything together. I felt my knees weaken and tears burned hot in my eyes. I thought of the ring Alex had given me, a plain, forgettable thing that had meant nothing in the end. This ring was different. It carried history, strength, endurance. It carried a promise that went deeper than words. My yes came out as a whisper, but David heard it as clearly as if I had shouted it across the water. He slid the ring onto my finger, and for the first time since the day I stood humiliated at an altar, I felt chosen not because I was the convenient option, but because I was his only option. Our wedding day was nothing like the grand, chaotic ceremony my mother once tried to orchestrate for me. This time, I chose every detail, not for appearances, not for approval, but for meaning. We were married in a botanical garden in Chicago, a hidden jewel that bloomed with wild roses, peonies, and ivy, climbing ancient stone walls. The guest list was small, just a circle of true friends, a handful of business partners who had become like family, and of course, Elena. She walked me down the aisle, her arms strong and steady, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had a mother's blessing. She whispered, "You deserve every ounce of this happiness," before placing my hand in David's. I wore a simple gown silk that flowed like water, elegant without extravagance. No lace trains designed to impress, no glittering embellishments meant for gossip magazines. Just me, stripped of everything false, walking toward the man who saw me clearly and still wanted me. When I reached him, David's eyes were wet, though he tried to smile. He didn't see a bride haunted by the shadows of her past. He saw me the woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing, who had stood back up after being shattered. The vows we spoke were not polished poetry or borrowed lines. They were raw, unguarded promises. I told him, "You are my proof that love can heal what was broken. I will walk beside you not just in joy, but in every storm." He replied, "You are the one I searched for when I didn't know I was searching. I vow to honor the fire in you, never to smother it." When we kissed, the applause around us faded. I felt only the weight of his hands and the certainty of a future that belonged to us alone. The reception was warm and intimate. We dined under strings of lights woven through the trees, laughter and music echoing through the garden. Elena gave a speech that had everyone wiping their eyes, saying she had watched me rise from ashes, and that this marriage was the proof that justice sometimes comes in the form of happiness. It felt like healing, like rewriting the ending to a story that had once ruined me. Yet, as perfect as it seemed, life has a way of sneaking shadows into the brightest days. During the reception, as I stood near the bar greeting guests, one of David's old college friends approached with a wide grin. He clapped David on the back and said, "Never thought I'd see the day you came back to Illinois after what happened to your family. Guess true love changes everything, huh?" My smile froze. I turned to David, waiting for him to respond, but he laughed lightly and changed the subject with practiced ease. "We're just happy to celebrate tonight," he said, steering the conversation toward the music. The friend didn't notice my unease, but I did. It was the first time David's past had brushed against mine in public, the first time I felt a door close just as I tried to peek inside. I let it go that night because happiness felt too precious to taint with suspicion. Still, the words lingered like smoke in the back of my mind. Why had he stayed away from Illinois? What had happened to his family? Questions. I wanted to ask, but didn't, not yet. For now I chose to rest in the warmth of the present, the vintage ring on my finger, the man who called me his future, and the life we were building together. I didn't know then that beneath the joy of that evening, the past was already winding its way toward us, weaving connections I had yet to discover. Little did I know this new last name would connect me to my past in ways I never could have imagined. The birth of my son felt like the closing of one chapter and the radiant beginning of another. When I held him for the first time, his tiny fist wrapped around my finger, I felt a sense of completeness I had never known before. We named him James after my father, the one person who had quietly loved me through all the storms of my youth, even when he didn't have the courage to fight against my mother. Giving my son that name was my way of reclaiming something that had been bruised in me for so long, a reminder that love, when genuine, deserved to be carried forward. The delivery room was filled with laughter and tears, and I remember looking over at David as he brushed hair from my damp forehead. He whispered, "He's perfect, just like you." Those words, so simple, carried more healing than years of therapy ever could have. The early months of motherhood were a blur of sleepless nights, midnight feedings, and learning how to swaddle with one hand while balancing a phone call with the other. But for once, I wasn't doing it alone. David was the kind of father who didn't just participate, he dove in head first. He learned how to soothe James with a steady rhythm of gentle rocking, how to prepare bottles at 3 in the morning, how to change diapers with the precision of someone tackling a business deal. He never once left me to carry the weight by myself, and that partnership deepened the bond between us in ways I hadn't imagined possible. Our home became a haven. By then, my company had grown beyond what I had once scribbled in a notebook during nights of hunger and despair. We bought a mansion in Lincoln Park, the kind with wide bay windows and a garden where roses bloomed against the Chicago sky. It wasn't just a house, it was proof that I had built something enduring, something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal. Every corner of that home echoed with laughter and life. James took his first steps on the polished wooden floors of our living room, stumbled toward David's waiting arms. And I remember thinking, this is the kind of moment my mother could never have imagined for me. My company had become the premier luxury event firm in Chicago. I had teams of planners working under me, and our events graced the pages of glossy magazines. Celebrities and CEOs trusted my vision, and when people asked how I'd built such an empire, I smiled without telling them the truth, that it had started from a broken bride with nothing but a suitcase and rage to fuel her. Recognition came with speaking engagements and features in business journals, but the satisfaction wasn't in the applause. It was in the knowledge that I had proved them wrong. All of them. As James grew, I began to measure my life less in contracts signed or galas executed, and more in milestones that mattered. His first words, his school recitals, the way his small hand slipped into mine when we crossed the street. All of it stitched together a life I once thought was impossible for me. I had once believed family was a word drenched in betrayal, but slowly, with David and James, it became something softer, warmer. There were Sunday mornings filled with pancakes and sticky fingers, evenings by the fireplace with David's arm around me and James curled in my lap, and quiet moments where I realized I had become the woman I was always meant to be. Still, there were times when memories intruded. Sometimes in the stillness of night, I would recall the humiliation of standing in that church alone in a white dress, whispers slicing through the silence. The image of my sister's smirk and my mother's cold words would flash through my mind, and for a moment the old bitterness would rise. But then I'd turn, and there would be David sleeping peacefully beside me, our son breathing softly down the hall. That was enough to remind me that I had won even without ever setting foot back into their world. 10 years. That was how long it had been since that cursed day. On the anniversary of what was supposed to be my first wedding, I sat in my office overlooking the Chicago skyline, the city spread out like a canvas beneath me. The sun dipped low, painting everything in gold, and I realized something profound I had become, everything they swore I never could be. My mother had told me I was weak, my sister had stolen the man I loved, and Alex had whispered that I wasn't enough. Yet here I was, wealthy, respected, loved, and stronger than I had ever dared to imagine. The broken girl in the wedding dress was gone. In her place stood a woman who had built an empire on her own terms. That night, David and I celebrated quietly. James was tucked into bed, and the two of us shared a glass of champagne in the kitchen. David raised his glass to me, his eyes glimmering with pride. To 10 years, he said. To everything we've built. I smiled, touched my glass to his, and thought of how far I had come from the girl who once boarded a bus with nothing but a vow of vengeance in her heart. I allowed myself to believe for the first time that the past was finally behind me, that the ghosts of betrayal had no more power over me. I was wrong. Just a week later, an envelope arrived at my office, elegant, gold-embossed with handwriting I recognized instantly. My hands trembled as I opened it, the words swimming before my eyes. It was an invitation, and with it, the reminder that my past was not finished with me. I thought I had finally escaped my past completely until the invitation arrived that would bring it all full circle. The Chicago skyline glittered beneath the late spring sun as I leaned against the window of my office watching the city I had fought tooth and nail to conquer. 10 years. A full decade since that day I had been humiliated at the altar, stripped of love, family, and dignity. In those 10 years I had clawed my way out of despair and into triumph, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, until my company stood tall as Chicago's premier luxury event firm. Now the Chicago Tribune had splashed my face on its Sunday cover, calling me a self-made success story. I clipped that headline and pinned it to my office wall, not for vanity, but as a reminder of the girl who once fled in a torn wedding dress and swore she'd return stronger. That promise was no longer just a whisper. It was about to take shape before the entire city. The idea for the gala had been brewing for months, but now it was fully formed, a 10-year anniversary celebration for my company, the kind of event that would draw not just the city's elite, but attention far beyond. The guest list was dazzling: mayors, celebrities, CEOs, and media magnates, all eager to toast the empire I had built from ashes. I designed every detail with precision, from the crystal chandeliers to the champagne fountains, ensuring the evening would be remembered for decades. But beneath the silk and gold, I had a sharper purpose. This wasn't just a celebration. It was a stage. David, ever my partner in both life and strategy, watched me pore over the invitations one evening as our son played nearby. "You're planning this like a military operation?" he teased, his hand brushing mine. I smiled but didn't deny it. He didn't know the depth of what I was planning, not yet. For him, this was a victory lap, proof that our hard work had secured a life no one could tear apart. For me, it was a reckoning. I had spent years envisioning what it would look like when they, the ones who had broken me, saw what I had become. My mother, who had sneered that I was too weak. My sister Sarah, who had strutted into that church with the man I loved on her arm. Alex, who had whispered vows to me one week and abandoned me the next. They had taken so much, but they had never expected me to rise. And now I would summon them not in anger's heat, but in triumph's cool glow, to witness the woman they had tried to destroy. "Are you sure you want them there?" David asked when I floated the idea of inviting my family. His brow furrowed, protective as ever. "You don't owe them anything." "No," I answered softly, swirling the stem of my wineglass, "but I owe myself closure. It's time to close that chapter forever." I kissed his cheek, letting him believe it was as simple as finding peace. But deep inside I was already plotting their unraveling. The Tribune article had painted me as resilient, unstoppable, the face of Chicago's new entrepreneurial elite. But I wanted more than headlines. I wanted their humiliation to mirror mine. I wanted the world to see the truth, that they were the weak ones, the selfish ones, the betrayers. And what better way than to bring them into my world of glitter and power, let them bask in it for a moment, and then watch it collapse around them. Late that night, when David had gone to bed and the house was still, I sat at my desk with a pen and 3 ivory envelopes. The guest list for the gala was hundreds long, but these 3 names made my hand shake with both fury and satisfaction as I wrote them out. Mother, Sarah, Alex. Each name etched in elegant calligraphy, each invitation a key to the trap I had been building for 10 years. I sealed them carefully, my breath steady now. This wasn't an impulsive act of revenge. This was strategy, patience, and justice woven together like silk thread on a loom. I could almost see their faces already pale and tight with shock as they stepped into the ballroom I had designed not just for celebration, but for revelation. As dawn crept through the curtains, I held the 3 invitations in my hand and felt the weight of the moment. 10 years of pain, hunger, struggle, rebuilding it all led here. My gala would be my triumph, but for them it would be the beginning of their reckoning. And that's when I decided to send 3 very special invitations, ones that would bring my past crashing into my present. They arrived like a challenge I could no longer ignore, 3 responses back from addresses I had written with a hand steady as a surgeon's. I had taken care with every detail of the invitations, thick ivory stock embossed lettering, a simple line inside, celebrating 10 years of success, hoping to share this milestone with family. To the world it read like a magnanimous gesture. To them it was a summons into the place I had rebuilt from pieces they thought broken. I posted them with the same calm I used to sign closing documents, trusting the calendar to do the rest. Then I waited. Back in their house, the envelopes landed on a kitchen table that had seen easier days. My mother was the first to pick hers up, her fingers trembling not from age but from curiosity. She held the card as though it were an accusation folded into paper. 10 years, she said aloud, tasting the number like it was unfamiliar. Sarah glanced over her shoulder from the sofa where the television muttered a late-night infomercial, and Alex was still in the back bedroom pretending to read paperwork for their failing venture. None of them expected me to have made anything of myself. That assumption was, I knew their greatest mistake. They passed the invitation around as though it were a relic from someone they barely remembered. My mother smoothed the embossed paper and let out a derisive laugh. She always was dramatic, she said, folding the card and tapping the corner with a manicured nail. Probably wants to show off. Maybe she needs our approval, after all. Her voice had the same clinical detachment she used when dismissing my scholarship years before, as though generosity could be reduced to a need for attention. The room hummed with the same smug certainty it had worn the day they watched me run from a church. They had learned nothing. Sarah, who had once delighted in my humiliation as if it legitimized her place at the center of my family, smiled in that way that used to make my guts turn. "We should go," she said, already picturing the ballroom and the guests. "Maybe she'll be feeling generous. Maybe she's desperate for family to support her success." She said we, as if she were including Alex as a strategic move, a partner in a rescue mission for their finances, rather than a companion in any meaningful sense. That thought stung, seeing the man who had once promised me forever reduced to a suit who scavenged for stability. Alex, when he finally emerged from the back room, seemed thinner than the photographs I'd once cherished, the edges of his features drawn by worry and nights of restless sleep. Their small online boutique had collapsed under the weight of unpaid invoices and a lease that rotated its terms like a trapdoor. He glanced at the invitation, then up at Sarah, and the calculation in his eyes was ugly and immediate. If she's wealthy now, he muttered more to himself than to them. Maybe she can help. Maybe there's a loan or a contract, something. I heard the desperation in the words and my stomach tightened. It was a different kind of betrayal to watch him measure the woman he had left not for love but for self-preservation. They talked in circles for the next hour, their conversation a litany of missteps and near misses that had brought them to this brink. Sarah complained about the landlord raising the rent again. Alex lamented a shipment held up at customs that would have saved them if only it had cleared. They both painted their predicament in a way that made attending my gala sound like common sense, an opportunity to secure a patronage that would pull them out of the quicksand. "If we play it right," Sarah told Alex, smoothing her skirt, "we can act humble, touch her arm, tell her about the business, make her feel needed." The plan was small and cynical and perfectly suited to their characters. My mother, however, held a different angle. Pride warred with practicality in her face. For a moment she considered not going at all, worrying that stepping into my world would expose more than they were willing to admit. But then her old instinct, the one that had driven her to engineer my humiliation in the first place, reasserted itself. "We'll go," she declared. voice clipped and certain. "We'll show the world we are family. We'll see what she's done. If she's truly risen, perhaps there's a way to ride her coattails. If not, at least we can say we were there." Her words were practiced diplomatic, the kind of language she used when deciding which charities to join for the sake of appearances. Underneath it all, I could hear the hunger for rescue murmuring like a hungry animal. As they packed and primped and rehearsed the lines they planned to speak, there was a current of fear they tried to hide behind bravado. The bills on the kitchen counter, the notice taped to the pantry about a past-due utility. These details bruised their composure, but they hid them as well as they hid their conscience. They dressed carefully the way people do when preparing to step into a room where they must perform a version of themselves that isn't honest. Sarah chose a dress with safe elegance, a muted color that signaled class without ostentation. My mother practiced a smile that would seem warm yet reserved. Alex ironed a tie with hands that trembled slightly. In the quiet moments before they left, Sarah touched my mother's arm and said softly, "If she refuses to help, we'll think of something else. We'll find another way." Her tone was almost filial, but it lacked sincerity. It was an alliance of convenience, not affection. They did not suspect that my reasons for inviting them went far beyond help or reconciliation. They thought my generosity might be purchased, that my success could be turned into a lifeline for them. That misjudgment would be their undoing. They had no idea they were walking into the trap I'd been setting for 10 years. The night of the gala shimmered with the kind of opulence I once thought belonged only to fairy tales and other women's lives. The Four Seasons ballroom gleamed under golden chandeliers, the tables covered in silk, the crystal glasses catching every light like diamonds. Guests moved in a gentle current of laughter and conversation, and I stood at the center of it all, dressed in a custom gown that fit like armor. It wasn't the dress I'd dreamed of when I was 22, and hopeful it was better because it was mine, chosen on my terms. The music softened as I finished greeting a group of investors, and then I saw them. My mother, my sister Sarah, and Alex stepping hesitantly through the tall glass doors, as if they weren't sure they belonged. They didn't. But they had come anyway, lured by the promise of success, or perhaps by the hope that I was still the weak girl they once discarded. I watched their faces freeze in place. My mother's lips parted slightly, her eyes scanning the ballroom as though she'd stepped into a dream she couldn't quite believe. Sarah clutched Alex's arm, her knuckles white, her posture stiff with discomfort. Alex, older now heavier, looked around as though searching for an escape. But there was none. They had come into my world, and here I reigned. I let them stand there for a moment, drinking in the shock on their faces, the disbelief that the woman commanding the attention of Chicago's elite was the same girl they had left crying in a church a decade ago. I moved toward them slowly, the crowd parting from me with an ease that told everyone here who truly belonged. My heels clicked against the polished marble floor, and each step made Sarah's eyes flicker, made Alex shift uneasily, made my mother tighten her jaw. When I reached them, I smiled warmly enough to fool the unknowing, but my eyes stayed sharp, cold, deliberate. "How wonderful you could make it after all these years," I said, my voice smooth as glass, carrying just enough sweetness to make the venom underneath unmistakable. Sarah's lips trembled into something like a smile, though it faltered as quickly as it appeared. Alex looked at the ground, unable to meet my gaze. My mother, ever the actress, lifted her chin. "You've done well for yourself," she said. It was meant to sound gracious, but her voice carried a tremor. I tilted my head slightly, feigning gratitude. "Yes," I replied. "Life has been generous." I let the pause linger until she squirmed under the weight of it. Then I gestured toward the crowd that had been watching this reunion with open curiosity. "Come, let me introduce you to my friends." They followed me reluctantly, my mother's eyes darting around the room, Sarah pressing her lips together tightly as if afraid of what might be said next. I led them straight into the center of the gathering, where some of Chicago's most influential names were mingling: mayors, CEOs, philanthropists, people whose approval my mother had always craved. I raised my glass lightly, catching the attention of those nearby. "Everyone," I said, my voice ringing with confidence, "I'd like you to meet my family. They're the ones who taught me everything I know about strength." There was a murmur of polite greetings, but I could feel the ripple of curiosity, the subtle tilt of heads, as people recalled old rumors, stories buried but never forgotten. My mother stiffened, realizing the weight behind my words. Sarah attempted a small laugh, nervous and brittle, while Alex simply stood awkward and silent, his tie slightly askew, as though even he knew he was out of place here. I introduced them one by one, each name landing like a stone in the quiet pool of conversation. With every handshake, with every polite smile, I could feel the questions forming on the lips of the crowd. What had they done? Why did I speak of strength in such a deliberate tone? As the introductions faded, I lingered on my mother just a little too long, watching her cheeks flush under the scrutiny. "My mother," I said softly, almost lovingly, though my eyes locked hers with the sharpness of a blade. She always believed in making the strongest choices for the family. The words hung heavy, and for a brief moment I saw fear flicker behind her practiced smile. I carried on smoothly, turning back to the crowd as if the moment had passed, but the tension remained thick and suffocating. My family shifted uncomfortably at my side, aware now that they weren't just guests. They were pieces on a chessboard I had arranged under the eyes of hundreds who admired me, and would soon see the truth I intended to unveil. And yet, as much as their discomfort thrilled me, this was only the beginning. Their punishment wasn't complete, not yet. I had promised myself that when the moment came, they would feel not just embarrassment, but devastation. And that moment was fast approaching. I let the silence stretch, then smiled brightly at the crowd, once more raising my glass high. "Thank you for welcoming my family," I said. "It means so much to have them here sharing this celebration." My voice was smooth, but inside my chest my heart beat with the thrum of anticipation. I wasn't finished, because the night's true revelation hadn't even begun. But they hadn't seen anything yet, because my husband was about to make his entrance. The music from the string quartet floated like silk across the ballroom, mingling with the soft hum of conversation and the clink of champagne flutes. My family stood near the entrance, stiff and uncertain, while I kept a watchful eye on them from across the room. I could practically feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes darting between me and them, like whispers waiting to be born. For a moment, I simply let the spectacle breathe. Their discomfort was part of the performance. It didn't take long. A group of older businessmen and their wives sitting near the front began murmuring to each other while glancing toward Sarah and Alex. One of them, a man with silver hair and sharp eyes, leaned forward, and I could hear him whisper just loud enough for others nearby to catch. "Isn't that the couple from that scandal years ago, the one where the bride got abandoned at the altar?" His wife gasped softly, covering her mouth with a gloved hand, and tilted her head toward me. "And that must have been her, the one left behind. Look at her now." The whispers spread like wildfire across the tables. I watched as heads turned one after another, eyes lingering on Sarah and Alex, before sliding back to me in awe. They had come thinking they would be able to blend into the glittering crowd, but their history was written across every guest's face, revived with every murmured recollection. Sarah's cheeks flushed deep red, and Alex shifted uncomfortably, loosening his tie as though it were strangling him. My mother, however, straightened her back and lifted her chin high, her lips pulling into that familiar smug line she wore whenever she wanted to pretend she was in control. I knew her too well. That mask of pride was nothing but fear stretched tight across her features. She stood close to Sarah, her hand resting on her daughter's arm, as though the touch could shield her from the scrutiny. But even she couldn't hide the faint tremor in her fingers. I moved deliberately across the ballroom, pausing every so often to greet a senator, a philanthropist, or a business tycoon, ensuring that my family remained perfectly visible in the background. I had placed them near the main stage intentionally, where no one could miss them. They were a living exhibit in my gallery of triumph. Every time I leaned in to shake a hand or share a gracious smile, I caught sight of another guest craning their neck, whispering, pointing discreetly in their direction. The tension grew thicker with each passing moment. Sarah tried to smile at a passing guest, but her lips quivered and her eyes darted nervously around the room. Alex kept his head down, sipping champagne far too quickly, his face pale under the ballroom's golden lights. My mother, sensing the shift in the crowd, attempted a bold move. She turned to a nearby couple, introducing herself with exaggerated warmth. "I'm her mother," she declared, gesturing toward me. "Isn't she marvelous?" The couple offered polite smiles, but their eyes betrayed a different thought. How could a mother like you have let such betrayal happen? I lingered by the stage, giving a short speech to a small cluster of guests about the journey of my company, my voice carrying across the hall. Strength. I said, letting my gaze fall squarely on Sarah and Alex, is often born from betrayal. From the darkest moments we rise. A ripple passed through the room. I didn't need to name names. The whispers returned louder now, feeding on the tension like flames on dry wood. I could feel my family shrinking under the weight of it, their shoulders curling inward, their eyes darting everywhere except toward me. I wanted them to feel the way I had once felt, naked, exposed, judged by everyone in the room. But this time, the humiliation was theirs, not mine. I stepped down from the stage, weaving through the crowd with practiced grace. Guests parted for me, their admiration like a tide lifting me higher, while behind me the murmurs pressed harder against Sarah and Alex. They looked like prey surrounded by predators trapped in a ballroom cage with nowhere to run. And just when the tension had stretched to its breaking point, when every head was already turned toward them and every whisper sharpened like a blade, I glanced toward the grand entrance of the ballroom. The doors opened, and the room seemed to pause. And then my husband walked in, and their faces went white as ghosts. The doors to the ballroom opened wider, and all conversations seemed to fall into a hush as David stepped into the light. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, the kind that seemed less like clothing and more like armor. Every line of it accentuated his tall frame, every polished detail declared power and refinement. His presence alone was enough to command the attention of the 300 guests, many of whom recognized him immediately as one of Chicago's most influential businessmen. A ripple of murmurs spread across the room, admiration mixing with curiosity. He carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he represented. I let myself drink in the moment, watching my family out of the corner of my eye. My mother's face drained of color the second her gaze landed on him. Her hand shot out, clamping down on Sarah's arm so tightly that my sister flinched. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "Oh my God, it's him!" The words trembling with a recognition that carried far more weight than the situation should have allowed. Alex's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing with something between panic and disbelief, while Sarah blinked rapidly as though trying to piece together a nightmare she hadn't realized she'd stepped into. David crossed the ballroom floor slowly, every stride, steady, unhurried, deliberate. Guests parted instinctively like the sea making way for a king, and as he drew closer to me, the golden light caught the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He knew the effect he was having. He knew the power of his presence here on this night in front of these people and in front of them. My chest swelled with a satisfaction so sharp it bordered on intoxicating. For years I had imagined this moment, the day I would no longer be the abandoned girl at the altar, the forgotten daughter in her mother's eyes. Now, in front of the very people who had broken me, I stood taller, stronger beside the man who not only loved me but embodied the success and security they could never tarnish. When David finally reached me, I slipped my arm through his, the gesture deliberate and elegant. My skin tingled at the contact, not from nerves, but from the sheer exhilaration of knowing my family was watching. Every eye in the room was fixed on us, and I wanted them to see me as I truly was, no longer their victim, but a woman who had built her own empire and chosen her own destiny. I turned back toward the crowd, my voice carrying easily over the soft music. "I'd like you all to meet my husband properly this time." The words lingered in the air, sharp and deliberate, a blade wrapped in silk. Gasps and murmurs swept through the ballroom again, and I caught the flicker of recognition in several faces as they began to connect dots that my family had already understood all too well. Sarah's lips parted, but no sound came out. Alex shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hands curling into fists at his sides as though bracing himself for a blow he couldn't see coming. And my mother, my proud, cold, manipulative mother, looked as though the ground had dropped from beneath her. Her eyes were wide, fixed on David as if staring at a ghost she had tried to bury long ago. The music swelled, the lights shimmered, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to hold its breath. I smiled, savoring the power in that silence, knowing that what they were feeling now was only the beginning. The look of pure terror in my mother's eyes told me she knew exactly who my husband was and why that was about to destroy them all. I stood at the edge of the stage with David's arm still linked through mine, feeling the electricity in the air. Every guest's gaze was pinned to us, their anticipation growing heavier with each second of silence. I let the moment stretch just long enough for my family to squirm under the weight of it. Then, with deliberate calm, I released David's arm and stepped onto the stage, the spotlight finding me as though it had been waiting. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor, each step echoing like a drumbeat of fate. I paused at the microphone, surveying the crowd with a practiced smile. Tonight, I began my voice smooth but steady. We are here to celebrate 10 years of building something extraordinary. 10 years of taking a dream and making it a reality. 10 years of proving that even when the world tries to break you, you can rise stronger than ever before. My eyes roamed across the faces before me, settling finally on the three who had once ensured my downfall. Their expressions were already strained, lips tight, shoulders tense. I let my gaze linger on them just long enough to make sure they felt seen. I continued, weaving my words carefully. What many of you may not know is that this company, this success was not born out of privilege or easy beginnings. It was forged out of betrayal, out of humiliation, out of a night when the very people who should have loved me most left me standing utterly alone. A ripple moved through the crowd. Soft gasps, startled murmurs, the quick exchange of looks between guests who had already heard whispers of what had happened years ago. I could see the recognition spreading like a flame, passing from one guest to another, until the entire ballroom was buzzing under the surface of my words. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught Sarah's lips parting in a silent protest, Alex tugging at his collar as though he couldn't breathe. My mother's hand gripped Sarah's arm again, her knuckles white, and I thought I heard her hiss something under her breath. The exact words didn't matter. I knew the sound of panic when I heard it. I was abandoned at the altar. I said clearly, the words slicing through the music and the murmurs like a blade. Left in front of 100 guests, humiliated, discarded as though I were nothing. Not by strangers, not by enemies, but by family. I didn't point. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. The weight of the truth hung in the air, undeniable, as eyes turned toward my mother, my sister, and Alex. They froze under the scrutiny, and for once the powerful, arrogant mask my mother had always worn seemed to crack. She tried to straighten her shoulders, tried to look proud, but her lips trembled as whispers grew louder around her. "It's them," someone said too loudly near the back. "That's the mother and the sister." Another voice chimed in, horrified. "And the groom." My God. My mother made a sudden move, tugging at Sarah's arm as if to pull her toward the exit. Her face was stiff, her eyes darting wildly toward the doors, her instincts telling her to flee before the truth came fully crashing down. But she hadn't anticipated what I had planned. Two of my event staff, dressed in sleek black uniforms that blended with the gala decor, stepped subtly into their path. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to halt her escape. She knew in that instant she was trapped. I leaned forward into the microphone, lowering my voice, just enough that the guests leaned in closer to catch every word. I built this empire not to erase that night, but to honor it. because betrayal taught me something my family never could: how to rise, how to turn ashes into gold, how to build a life so radiant it blinds the very people who tried to snuff out my light. Gasps and murmurs echoed louder now, the ballroom trembling with the tension of revelation. My family looked cornered, their eyes wide and glassy, their carefully constructed facades crumbling with every second. And then, as the silence stretched and the pressure mounted, I let the next words fall like a hammer. And then I said the words that would change their lives forever. But tonight, I want to share the full story with evidence. The air in the ballroom had already turned heavy after my speech, but when the screen behind me flickered to life, the silence deepened into something almost suffocating. I could feel hundreds of eyes trained on me, on the stage, on the story I was about to tell, without uttering a single word. My hands didn't shake as I pressed the remote. I had waited too long for this moment. The footage began grainy, almost ordinary, a camera fixed at the back of the church on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The date in the corner read clear as day, the morning of my wedding. I heard the audible intake of breath from several guests as the first image filled the screen, me in a white dress waiting in the wings. Then the frame shifted. Someone had captured the hallway just outside the sanctuary. My mother's voice rang out first, crisp and cutting. "Alex, listen to me," she said, her tone the same mix of sweet and stern I had grown up dreading. "She is too weak for you. She doesn't have what it takes to be your wife. Sarah is stronger. Sarah will give you the success you deserve." The camera caught Alex's conflicted expression, caught the way he rubbed his face like a man already cornered. Then my mother leaned closer, whispering words that felt like a knife reopening wounds I thought had scarred over long ago. "I will make it worth your while. Choose Sarah at the altar, and I'll see to it that your future is secure. Don't throw your life away on the wrong daughter." Gasps rippled through the crowd, sharp intakes of breath like a wave. Someone in the audience muttered, "My God," loud enough that others turned toward them before their eyes darted back to the screen. I heard muffled whispers building around the room, recognition dawning on people who had only heard vague rumors of what had happened that day. Now they were watching it unfold with their own eyes. The footage shifted again. This time it was the altar itself. My back was turned, standing tall in my gown, blissfully unaware. Alex's seat was empty. The camera zoomed just enough to catch my mother in the front pew, her lips curving into the faintest of smirks. The betrayal played out in stark, undeniable truth. Before the murmurs could die down, another file queued up a set of audio recordings. My voiceover explained, calm and steady. These were taken the week before the wedding, captured during phone calls. I didn't know existed until years later. My mother's voice filled the speakers again, unmistakable, vicious under its veneer of gentleness. "She's dead weight, Alex. She'll hold you back. Sarah is better. Sarah is stronger. Think carefully about your future. Do you want to succeed, or do you want to drown with her?" Every cruel word echoed in the hall, amplified not just by the speakers, but by the weight of public judgment. Phones lit up across the room. Guests were recording, posting, sharing. I caught glimpses of screens displaying captions like "family betrayal caught on tape" and hashtags already beginning to trend. My mother's face, seated at her table near the stage, went ashen. She shook her head violently, mouthing "No, no, no," as though denial could erase the evidence now glowing larger than life above her. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide in panic, while Alex stared down at the table as if the floor might swallow him whole. The crowd wasn't silent anymore. Outrage sparked in murmurs, growing louder as the reality sank in. A woman near the front row turned to her companion and hissed, "She bribed him. Her own daughter's wedding. Unbelievable." Another voice added, "What kind of mother does that?" Their disgust spread, feeding on itself, until the once celebratory atmosphere had transformed into a trial with my family in the defendant's seat and no hope of acquittal. I let the weight of the evidence hang there, let the whispers and the gasps build into the thunder of social condemnation. My eyes found my mother's across the room. She tried to hold my gaze, but for the first time in my life she faltered. Her chin dipped. Her shoulders collapsed inward. The mask she had worn for decades cracked before everyone's eyes. I drew a steadying breath, my voice cutting cleanly through the noise as I stepped forward again. You've now seen the truth that was hidden from me for so many years. You've seen how the people who should have loved me most orchestrated my humiliation for their own gain, but that I paused watching their terrified faces, savoring the moment. That was just the beginning, because the biggest secret was about to be revealed. I let the silence linger just long enough for the weight of the video to settle in the ballroom. People shifted in their seats, some whispering to their neighbors, others staring openly at my mother and Sarah, whose faces were pale under the glaring lights. My pulse hammered in my chest, but I kept my voice steady, my smile controlled. But betrayal, I said slowly, is never the work of just one hand. Some lies are woven carefully strand by strand until they form a web so tangled the guilty believe they can never be caught. The screen flickered to life again. This time it wasn't grainy wedding footage. It was a slideshow of messages, each one blown up so the entire room could read the words clearly. Sarah's words, not mine. Can you believe she still thinks this wedding is happening? One message read, "She looks pathetic trying on those cheap dresses. Don't worry, soon she'll be out of the picture, and we'll be the ones people admire." Laughter filled the background of an audio clip that followed Sarah's laughter. She was mocking me, my plans, my dreams, all while slipping into my fiancé's arms. The crowd gasped as another message appeared. "We can do better together, Alex. She's weak. With me, you'll rise. With her, you'll sink." I watched as Sarah shrank in her seat, her hands clutching the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. My mother hissed something in her ear, but Sarah shook her head, tears streaking down her face. The humiliation was only beginning. I shifted gears. "And lies don't stop once a bride is abandoned," I continued. "No, sometimes they grow into crimes." The next slide displayed financial documents, loan papers, forged signatures, and debt statements all tied to my name. Gasps rippled through the audience as I explained. While I was struggling to rebuild my life in Chicago, my mother and sister used my identity. They took out loans in my name, destroyed my credit, and ensured that if I ever tried to come back, I'd have nothing waiting for me but ruin. A man in the audience muttered, "That's fraud." Another whispered, "How could a mother do that?" I let the murmurs rise before adding, "They wanted to make sure I stayed buried, but they underestimated me." The documents on the screen shifted to recent emails, ones intercepted with the help of my legal team. "And if you thought they came here tonight out of remorse or pride in my accomplishments," I said, locking eyes with Sarah, "you'd be wrong. They came here because they are desperate. Their business is bankrupt, their marriage is crumbling, and they thought they could use me one more time, trick me into rescuing them. Isn't that right, Sarah?" My sister tried to speak, but her voice cracked and nothing came out. The audience was no longer whispering. They were openly condemning her, shaking their heads in disbelief, some even recording the scene on their phones. My mother's lips moved quickly, forming silent prayers or curses, I couldn't tell which. For a moment, I allowed myself to savor it. 10 years of humiliation, pain, and struggle had led me here, to this room, to this stage, to this truth finally laid bare. And yet I knew this was still not the end. This was only the unraveling of their lies. The real strike, the blow they would never recover from, was still to come. I let the silence stretch until it was unbearable. Then I turned slightly and gestured to the man waiting patiently just behind me. My voice was calm, deliberate, almost gentle. And then I said, my husband stepped forward and finally told them exactly who he was. David stepped forward, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. His presence commanded silence, though the crowd was already hushed from the evidence I had revealed. He took the microphone with calm, measured hands, but I saw the storm behind his eyes. My mother's face had drained of all color, and Sarah's nails dug into the tablecloth as though she could anchor herself against what she already sensed was coming. David's voice, when it filled the ballroom, was steady and clear, each word chosen with surgical precision. "My name is David Richardson," he began. There was a ripple through the crowd as recognition sparked among a few of the older business people in the room. Some of you may remember my family. We once owned Richardson Manufacturing, a company my father built from the ground up. It was more than just a business, it was his life's work, his pride, and his legacy. His pause stretched long enough for the name to settle, and then his eyes cut directly toward my mother. 15 years ago, that company collapsed, and it wasn't by accident. It was because of embezzlement orchestrated by the woman sitting right there. The collective gasp from the guests was sharp like glass shattering. My mother tried to shake her head, tried to form the words of denial, but David pressed on his voice, gaining strength. She and her husband siphoned funds, manipulated accounts, and drained resources until the company my father had built couldn't stand anymore. Within months, everything was gone. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs. My family lost our livelihood. And my father. His voice faltered for just a second, and I saw his hand tighten around the microphone. My father had a heart attack the day we lost it all. He never recovered. I buried him with nothing but the ruins of what they had destroyed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Guests stared openly at my mother, whose lips trembled, but whose eyes remained defiant, as if denial alone could erase the truth now laid bare. Sarah's face twisted in shock. She hadn't known the full scope of what her mother had done. Alex sat frozen, as if realizing for the first time that he had tethered himself to a family built on rot. David exhaled slowly, then turned his gaze toward me. His voice softened but carried even greater weight. "When I met her," he said, nodding in my direction, "I didn't know who she was. I didn't know her family name, her history, her connection to the people who had destroyed mine. I only knew her fire, her determination, her brilliance. I saw someone who had turned her pain into strength, who was building something remarkable out of ashes." He shifted his eyes back to my mother, his jaw tight. "But when I learned the truth, when I realized that fate had brought me into the life of the daughter of the very woman who stole everything from my family, I understood something deeper. This was justice. Not by courts or by chance, but by destiny." The crowd erupted with murmurs, the story spreading through them like wildfire. Phones were already raised, recording every second of the revelation. My mother's mask of defiance cracked, her mouth opening and closing without sound, as if words had abandoned her. Sarah's tears spilled freely now, not for me, not for remorse, but for fear of what this meant for her own future. I stood beside David, my hand brushing his as I steadied myself against the tidal wave of emotions surging through me. Betrayal, vindication, grief, and pride swirled together in a storm I could barely contain. 10 years ago, I had stood abandoned at an altar broken by the very people who should have loved me most. And now, standing in this glittering ballroom, they faced the man whose family they had destroyed, a man who had chosen to stand at my side. The symmetry was undeniable, the justice poetic. I looked at my mother and sister, their faces ashen and hollow, and I realized they finally understood they hadn't just betrayed me. They had walked straight into a trap designed not only by their victim's daughter, but by the victim himself. And this was only the beginning. Their faces went ashen as they realized they'd walked into a trap orchestrated by their own victim and his daughter. The ballroom was so quiet after David's revelation that I could hear the faint hum of the chandeliers above. My mother's face was frozen in disbelief. Sarah clutched Alex's arm as though she could keep herself from toppling, and Alex simply stared at the floor, pale and trembling. I thought that would be enough, that seeing the truth of what they had done to David's family would be its own punishment. But David had promised me something more than truth. He had promised justice. And now it was time to deliver it. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick stack of documents, their official seals gleaming under the soft light. My breath caught as he handed them to me with a small nod, and I stepped forward, turning to face the crowd. "Some betrayals are emotional," I began, my voice steady though my heart thundered. "Some cut us deeply and leave scars that never fade. but others are written in ink on contracts and bank statements. Tonight, we aren't speaking only of broken promises, we're speaking of stolen futures. The screens flanking the ballroom lit up once more, this time with scanned documents, forged signatures, falsified ledgers, checks deposited into accounts that weren't theirs. I heard the sharp intake of gasps ripple through the room as the names of my mother and Alex appeared in black and white. These, I said, holding up a page so the audience could see the highlighted line, are records of embezzlement. My family thought time would bury their crimes, that the statute of limitations would shield them. But civil law doesn't forget so easily. The crowd began murmuring, reporters already pulling out their phones, the air crackling with anticipation. My mother finally found her voice shrill and shaking. "This is a setup, Lies." But her protests only grew weaker as David raised his voice over hers, announcing that liens had already been filed. The words dropped like stones into the silence. Their failing business, Sarah and Alex's last desperate venture, was already seized. Their home, the one my mother had boasted about to every neighbor, was no longer theirs. Every asset they had gained through manipulation and theft now belonged to the courts and soon to restitution. I turned back to them, watching as Sarah's face crumpled as Alex pressed both hands over his eyes, as my mother swayed and had to grip the table for balance. They had stolen my dignity once, left me standing alone in a church in a dress meant for joy, but soaked in humiliation. Now I had stolen theirs, not with cruelty, but with truth. The silence in the room thickened into something electric. One by one, the guests turned their backs on them, refusing eye contact, whispers of disgust floating like smoke. My mother looked at me, then her eyes blazing with hatred. But beneath it, I saw something else for the first time: fear. Real fear. And that was when I leaned closer to the microphone, letting the weight of the moment stretch until it nearly broke. "You thought you could destroy me," I said softly, "but all you destroyed was yourselves." Their ruin was already sealed on paper. But I wasn't finished, because the final blow would come from the last person they ever expected. I took the microphone back into my hand, my heart steady and my eyes locked on the people who had once destroyed me. My father, my adoptive father, had just made his confession and turned against my mother, handing me the deed to their house, as if it were both an apology and an offering. The room was buzzing with disbelief, with whispers and glances flying in every direction. And then he stepped down from the stage and stood beside me, not across from me as he had so many times in my life. For the first time I felt the weight of his protection, and for the first time my mother realized she was truly alone. I turned to the crowd, but my eyes were still fixed on her. She sat rigid in her chair, her lips quivering as though she wanted to scream but couldn't. The years of her careful control were crumbling in front of 300 witnesses. My father cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone once more. For years, he said, I let myself be silent. I let her force me into schemes I wanted no part of. She threatened me, manipulated me, and I obeyed because I thought protecting the family meant protecting her. His voice cracked and the room fell into silence. But protecting her destroyed the family, and it destroyed the daughter I should have defended. Tonight I put an end to that. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit and pulled out a thin stack of papers which he handed to me. His hands shook, but his eyes were steady. I've filed for divorce. The assets are already transferred. Everything that should have been yours years ago now belongs to you. Gasps rippled across the ballroom. Some guests clapped softly, others just sat frozen, stunned by the spectacle of a man publicly tearing his wife down after decades of silent compliance. My mother's face drained of color, her hand clutched the edge of the table as if she might collapse. Sarah reached toward her, but she shook her daughter off with a violent motion, her pride refusing even pity. I could feel the eyes of the room shifting between us, between the woman who had once pulled the strings and the daughter who now held them. My father's voice broke through again, quieter now, but pointed. This is my repayment to the daughter I failed. This is my way of saying I'm sorry. He turned toward me, his eyes wet. I can't undo the past, but I can stand by you now. The words nearly undid me, but I didn't allow the tears to fall. Not yet. Instead, I nodded and took the papers, slipping them onto the podium beside me. My mother's glare burned into me, but it was powerless now, stripped of authority, stripped of influence. She had nothing left but her fury. I let the silence stretch, let her sit in the ashes of everything she had built on lies. Then I looked out at the audience and smiled, though my voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut glass. "You see," I said slowly, "betrayal doesn't only destroy its victims, it destroys the betrayers. Sometimes it just takes time for the collapse to catch up." The ballroom erupted in applause, the sound swelling and surrounding me a chorus of vindication. And as my father handed me the deed, his trembling hands brushing against mine, I realized my revenge was nearly complete. But the sweetest part, the part I had been waiting for all these years, was still to come. Their stunned silence after my father's revelation still hung in the air when I stepped forward, holding a folder so thick it could have been a weapon. My voice carried steady across the ballroom, calm, yet sharpened by years of pain honed into precision. "Now you face a choice," I told them: criminal charges and bankruptcy, or servitude under the very woman you tried to erase. Gasps echoed through the room, but my words were meant only for the three faces before me: my mother, Sarah, and Alex. Their eyes darted between each other like trapped animals searching for an escape route. None existed. I opened the folder and spread copies of contracts across the table in front of them. The gold crest of my company gleamed at the top, mocking them with legitimacy. I explained each clause not in anger but with surgical clarity. They would work as janitors and caterers at my events. They would wear pressed uniforms stitched with their names in bold thread. They would mop floors, polish glasses, and serve champagne to the very people who had just witnessed their disgrace. And every paycheck would come from me a weekly reminder that their survival depended on the daughter, sister, and fiancé they had cast aside. Sarah's face contorted in disbelief, her lips trembling as she whispered, "You can't be serious." My mother's hand gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles whitened. Alex avoided my eyes entirely, sweat sliding down his temple as if he were already laboring under the weight of a mop. "Serious." I leaned closer, locking eyes with my mother. "I've never been more serious in my life." I gave them their final push. "Refuse, and the lawsuits will bury you. Sign, and you get to keep a roof over your heads even if it's under my terms." The room was so silent I could hear the tick of the grand ballroom clock. My mother's mask cracked first. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes dulled. For the first time in my life, she looked smaller than me. She picked up the pen, her hand shaking, and scratched her name across the page. Sarah followed, tears streaming silently down her cheeks as she scrawled her signature in shaky strokes. Alex hesitated the longest, his pride battling reality, but when I slid the papers back toward him, his hand trembled so violently the ink bled into the page. I gathered the contracts, sliding them neatly back into the folder, and straightened with the poise of a queen collecting tribute from fallen enemies. My voice cut through their shame like the final toll of a bell. With one signature, they became my employees, and my subjects in the empire they tried to prevent me from building. The ink on the contracts had barely dried when Sarah's composure shattered like glass. She dropped to her knees in the middle of the ballroom, the polished marble catching the fall of her body as if it had been waiting for her collapse. The sound of her sobs echoed across the hushed room, raw and uncontrolled, tearing through the last fragments of dignity she clung to. "Please," she cried, her voice breaking into high-pitched desperation. "Please forgive me. I was wrong. I shouldn't have taken him from you. I shouldn't have listened to her. I was jealous, I was stupid. Please, I'll do anything." The guests gasped, some covering their mouths, others leaning forward with hungry curiosity. And then came the flashbulbs. Photographers, sensing blood in the water, raised their cameras and fired relentlessly, each click immortalizing Sarah's disgrace from every angle. I stood tall, the hem of my gown brushing the floor just inches from her trembling hands. For once, the entire room saw her as I had always seen her, not the golden child, not the favored daughter, but a desperate, broken woman scrambling for mercy. As Sarah clutched at the air around my ankles, Alex finally spoke. His voice rang sharp, cutting her pleas in half. "Enough," he said. He stepped forward, tugging at his left hand, and with a decisive twist, slipped off his wedding ring. The crowd gasped again as he held the band up like evidence, before letting it fall onto the ballroom floor with a metallic clink that seemed louder than thunder. "I can't be associated with this anymore," he said, his tone cold final. "You've dragged me down far enough. I'm done." Then he turned and walked away, each step deliberate, each stride carrying him closer to the exit and further from the woman he once claimed to love. Sarah's cries rose higher, sharper as her hands scraped at the marble floor, reaching toward him. "Alex, please don't leave me. Don't you dare leave me." But he never looked back. The cameras caught it all, her crumpled body, the ring glinting on the ground, the emptiness in her eyes as the truth dawned on her. She was alone. Completely, utterly alone. Her husband had abandoned her just as she once abandoned me. Her reputation was gone shredded under the gaze of 300 witnesses. Her security had dissolved with a single contract and a single discarded ring. And now she was left with nothing. No wealth, no power, no love. Nothing but me, the sister she had betrayed, the one who now owned her future. Sarah's sobs shook her shoulders as she clung to the fabric of my gown, but I felt no warmth, no compassion. Her tears didn't move me. They reminded me of my own tears that she and Mother ignored 10 years ago. Sarah's sobs still echoed across the ballroom floor when my mother rose to her feet. Her spine was rigid, her chin high, her eyes blazing with the same fire she had wielded against me all my life. For a moment the room hushed again, waiting to see if she would crumble like Sarah, or claw her way back to the dignity she thought she possessed. She chose defiance. Her voice rang out sharp and cutting, slicing through the silence. "Look at you!" She spat her finger aimed at me like a dagger. "You've become everything I said. You'd never be cruel, cold, heartless. You humiliate your own blood in front of strangers. You drag us through the mud just to feed your pride. And you dare call this justice." Her words bounced off the marble walls, but they didn't hit me the way she wanted them to. I had heard her accusations my whole life. Weak, useless, not enough. This was nothing new, only louder, but the crowd's reaction was new. A wave of boos rolled through the ballroom, rising higher with each second. Guests shook their heads, some even shouting back at her. "You're the cruel one," a man near the stage called. "We saw the video you manipulated your own daughter." A woman in an evening gown hissed, "You're evil. How could you do that to your child?" Phones lit up across the room as guests posted clips of her earlier confession, spreading her disgrace across the internet in real time. I caught glimpses of headlines already forming on screens: "Mother exposed as mastermind of wedding betrayal. Family humiliated at Gala of the Year." My mother's face paled at the sight of those glowing rectangles capturing her downfall, but she pressed on her voice, trembling with fury. "They only see what you want them to see. You've twisted everything. I did what I had to do for this family. I made the hard choices because you were too weak to handle them." She tried to summon the old authority she once held over me, the dominance she had wielded with a glance or a sigh. But it wasn't working anymore. Not on me. Not on anyone here. Her words fell flat against the storm of condemnation rising from the crowd. Even those who had once admired her looked at her with disgust, their faces turned away as if the sight of her stained them. My mother's voice faltered, for the first time the power in it leaking out like air from a punctured balloon. She looked around, her gaze flicking from the guests to the cameras, to Sarah crumpled at my feet, and then finally to me. What she saw must have chilled her to the bone. I wasn't the weak girl she'd discarded, the daughter she dismissed as unworthy. I was a woman who had built an empire from her ashes, who now stood taller, stronger, and infinitely more powerful than she had ever been. She had tried to break me, But in doing so, she had forged me into something she could no longer control, something that terrified her. Her hand shook as she pointed at me again, but the conviction was gone. Her voice cracked ragged, betraying the fear beneath her rage. You're the monster now," she whispered, her words splintering under the weight of her realization. And I saw it dawn in her eyes, the bitter truth she could no longer deny. Her voice cracked as she realized she'd created the very monster that destroyed her. The ballroom still hummed with the echoes of my mother's broken voice when the world outside began to take notice. By the time the last guest had left, videos of the night were already climbing the digital ladder of virality. Clips of Sarah on her knees, Alex throwing his ring to the floor, and my mother screaming accusations were plastered across every corner of social media. By dawn, the hashtags #WeddingRevenge and #KarmaQueen had spread like wildfire, trending not just in Chicago, but in New York, Los Angeles, and London. Millions of strangers were watching the downfall of the family that once destroyed me, and they were celebrating. The comments were merciless, but for once they weren't aimed at me. People wrote, "This is the justice we live for," and 10 years of patience, and she delivered the perfect revenge. I had become the heroine of a story that once branded me the humiliated bride. My phone buzzed constantly for days afterward. Reporters clamored for interviews, podcasts wanted my voice, and magazines begged for exclusive rights to my story. For years I had been invisible in the shadow of Sarah's Golden Girl glow, but now I was the face of resilience. Sitting in studio chairs under hot lights, I spoke about betrayal strength and the power of rebuilding. I kept my words measured, never indulging in gloating, though the satisfaction simmered beneath every syllable. I told them that pain could be fuel, that humiliation could be transformed into empire. Audiences leaned in not just to my story, but to the message behind it. Offers rolled in faster than I could process. A book deal with a major New York publisher landed on my desk, followed by calls from 2 production companies wanting to turn my story into a documentary series. The woman who had once cried alone in a moldy apartment now had Hollywood knocking on her door. Each opportunity widened my reach, pulling more eyes toward the empire I had built, and that empire grew at a pace even I hadn't anticipated. Clients who once hesitated to work with me now rushed to secure my company for their galas, weddings, and fundraisers. Wealthy families and corporate giants wanted to be associated with the woman who had captured the world's imagination. Within a year, my business doubled, then tripled, and I expanded into cities I had once only dreamed of touching. I stood at the helm of one of Chicago's most powerful event management firms, my name synonymous with elegance, strength, and justice. In boardrooms, men twice my age deferred to my judgment. On stages, audiences of thousands rose to their feet to applaud my speeches. The very society that had once pitied me now admired me, even envied me. I had everything I had ever dreamed of: wealth, power, recognition, and the sweet vindication of watching my enemies reduced to footnotes in my story. And yet, even as the world celebrated me, a quiet thought tugged at the back of my mind. Beneath the flashing cameras and glowing praise, there lingered a single unfinished thread, one final weight pressing on my chest. I had everything I'd ever dreamed of, but there was one final conversation I needed to have. The night after the gala, when the noise of the world finally quieted and the house was still, David asked me to sit with him in the library. The firelight threw shadows across his face, softening the lines I knew so well, but also revealing a gravity in his expression I had never seen before. For a moment I thought he was simply exhausted from the chaos of the evening, but then he reached for my hand with a tenderness that told me this wasn't about fatigue. This was about truth. He began slowly, as though each word carried the weight of years. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice low but steady. My heart tightened, but I nodded for him to continue. He told me that long before we met, he had known of my family. He had been tracking their movements following their business dealings, piecing together the wreckage they had left behind. At first, he admitted it was not about me at all. It was about revenge. His father's company had been gutted by embezzlement orchestrated by my mother and the man I once called my stepfather, and that destruction had driven his own father to an early grave. He had lived with that bitterness for years, determined to one day make them pay. Hearing those words, a chill passed through me, but I did not pull my hand away. He was not speaking like a man gloating over a victory. He was speaking like someone confessing a sin. He told me that when we first crossed paths, he hadn't known who I was. He was drawn to me, he said, because of my fire, my refusal to bow to the weight of betrayal. It wasn't until later, after his feelings had already taken root, that he discovered my connection to the very people he had been watching. I thought fate was playing a cruel joke on me, he admitted. But then I realized it wasn't a joke. It was the universe giving me a choice. I could use you, or I could love you. And loving you was the only choice that ever made sense. My eyes burned with tears I didn't try to hide. For years I had lived under the shadow of manipulation and deceit. To hear the man I trusted most admit he had once been led by revenge could have shattered me, but the way he looked at me told me this was no trap. He had chosen me, not my bloodline. He had seen me for who I was, not for the sins of those who raised me. He went on explaining how our marriage had become more than love, though love was at its core. It was destiny. Two broken people, both wronged by the same cruel hands, had found each other, not in bitterness, but in strength. We are proof, he said, squeezing my hand, that pain can be transformed. That justice and love don't have to be enemies. I thought back to every moment of our journey together, from the first gala where he looked at me as though I were the only one in the room, to the nights when we planned our future side by side. It all fell into place. We weren't just building a business or a family. We were building something larger, a legacy of justice born from betrayal. And then he surprised me again. He said he wanted us to use our combined power not just to revel in victory over my family, but to help others who had suffered similar wounds. Betrayed children, abandoned spouses, people crushed under financial deceit and manipulation. We could be their voice, their safety net, their champions. For years, my life had been consumed by survival, then by revenge. But hearing David's vision, I felt the possibility of something greater. We could transform the ashes of our past into a fire that warmed others instead of just burning down enemies. That night, as the fire in the hearth dimmed and the house settled into silence, I leaned against him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. For the first time, I understood that all the pain I had endured, all the battles I had fought, had not just led me to freedom or even to triumph. They had led me to him, and together we were not just husband and wife. We were destiny fulfilled. As we held each other that night, I realized that sometimes the universe gives you exactly the partner you need, not just for love, but for justice. In the weeks after David's confession, life settled into a strange rhythm. My world outside the house was filled with glowing interviews, headlines, and people eager to attach themselves to my story. But inside my company, another drama was playing out, a private theater of humiliation, where my mother, my sister, and Alex had become unwilling actors in a show I had scripted. I told myself it was justice. At first, it felt like it. I would walk into one of my events, a glittering charity gala at the Four Seasons, or a corporate celebration overlooking the lake, and see Sarah bent over a bucket scrubbing the marble floors of a bathroom. She wore the standard uniform with her name embroidered across the chest, a name once uttered in admiration at country clubs and bridal boutiques, now displayed on a janitor's patch. I saw her old acquaintances glide past in gowns and jewels, their polite eyes avoiding her as though she were invisible. Sometimes they whispered and sometimes they didn't bother. Watching her cheeks flush as she bent lower to avoid their gaze filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't known I was capable of. My mother fared no better. Once she had walked through rooms like these with her head held high, collecting admiration as though it were her birthright. Now she carried trays of champagne flutes, her once perfect nails chipped, her hands trembling when guests she had once courted for favors ignored her, or worse, smirked in recognition. I made sure she served people who remembered her sharp tongue, the ones she had looked down on when she thought she was untouchable. The first time I saw her standing at the edge of the ballroom waiting for a signal to pour drinks, I almost laughed. Almost. Alex, though, was different. He wore the same uniform as the others, but instead of slumping under its weight, he seemed determined to use it as penance. He arrived early, stayed late, and carried out every task with an almost military precision. Unlike Sarah, who sulked and dragged her feet, Alex polished silverware until it shone, carried heavy trays without complaint, and even helped younger employees without being asked. At first I thought it was pride. Then the letters began, slipped under my office door or left on my desk after events they were written in his neat, familiar hand. Each one was an apology. He wrote of shame, regret, and the life we might have had if he had been stronger, if he had chosen differently. He promised he had never stopped thinking of me. I read them all and responded to none. It was easier to keep them as proof of his suffering than to destroy them. Some nights I would sit in my office long after everyone else had gone, rereading his words and remembering the man who once held my hand by Lake Michigan and promised we would conquer the world together. That memory still hurt, but it no longer controlled me. I told myself that watching him serve me now was enough. For a time it was. Yet the longer I watched them, the less clean my victory began to feel. There was no question they deserved it, Sarah for her cruelty, my mother for her manipulation, Alex for his weakness. I had promised myself they would regret what they had done, and they did. Every day I could see it etched on their faces, in the slump of Sarah's shoulders, in the tremor of my mother's hands, in the quiet resignation in Alex's letters. But with each passing week, something in me began to shift. I had expected their humiliation to fill the hollow places inside me, to erase the pain of standing alone at that altar. Instead, it was like drinking salt water. The more I consumed, the thirstier I became, and the less satisfied I felt. Standing at the back of a ballroom one evening, I watched Sarah struggle to carry a bucket past a group of women who used to invite her to spa weekends. They laughed openly at her, and though part of me wanted to savor it, another part felt unexpectedly heavy, almost weary. This was what I had worked toward for 10 years. Their downfall, their disgrace, their servitude. I had it all, and yet the sight of them broken no longer felt like triumph. It felt like something else entirely, something I wasn't ready to name. But seeing them broken every day started to feel less satisfying and more empty. James was 5 years old when he asked the question that stopped me cold. I had just come home from overseeing a lavish corporate gala my company had organized at one of the city's grand hotels. The event had been flawless, the kind of evening that reinforced my reputation as Chicago's most sought-after event planner. Yet what lingered with me was not the applause of executives or the compliments from socialites, but the sight of Sarah scrubbing wine stains from the carpet, and my mother balancing trays of champagne, her hands trembling under the weight. Alex had been stationed at the valet stand all night, opening car doors for people who once envied his tailored suits. I had watched them with a mixture of satisfaction and a cold, hollow ache that even success couldn't quiet. That night I tucked James into bed, the golden glow of his nightlight softening his round face. He curled into me, his little hands clutching my blouse. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice so innocent it made me catch my breath. "Why do those people at your parties always look so sad?" The lady with the gray hair dropped a glass today, and she looked like she was going to cry. And the other one, the younger one, she was on her knees cleaning, and her eyes were red. For a moment I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. He was talking about them, my mother, my sister, the ghosts of my past who now lived under my command. I forced a smile, brushing his hair back. "Sometimes work makes people tired, sweetheart," I said softly. But James's wide eyes searched mine, too perceptive for his age. "But why do they only work for you, Mommy? And why do they look sad when you smile?" I felt the air leave my lungs. How could I explain decades of betrayal and revenge to a child who still believed in superheroes and happy endings? How could I tell him that the sad woman balancing drinks was the same mother who had told me I wasn't enough? That the one on her knees had stolen my fiancé and my wedding day? That the man holding car doors had once stood silently while they broke me? James wouldn't understand. He shouldn't understand. I make them work for me because they hurt me a long time ago. I admitted carefully, my voice lower than I intended. And now they have to pay for what they did. He tilted his head, absorbing my words. Like a punishment. Yes, I whispered. Like a punishment. James frowned, his tiny brows knitting together. But if they're always sad, does that mean you're still sad too? The question pierced me in a way no insult from my mother ever had. My victories. The contracts, the magazine covers, the empire suddenly seemed fragile when refracted through the eyes of a child. I had built everything to prove I was stronger, smarter, unstoppable. But to my son, it looked like I had built a kingdom on top of someone else's misery. I kissed his forehead, telling him it was time to sleep. But long after he closed his eyes, I sat beside him staring at the wall. His words echoed sharp and insistent. Was I still sad? The truth was complicated. Part of me felt triumphant every time I saw my mother bow her head or Sarah scrub a floor. But another part, one I rarely acknowledged, felt empty. Because each day they served me, they reminded me of the very wound I thought I had healed. My son had seen it clearly, their sadness tethered me to my own. The next morning, I walked through the ballroom during cleanup, watching Sarah mop in silence. She glanced up, our eyes locking for a fraction of a second. I expected to feel that old surge of vindication. Instead, I felt James's voice inside me asking why she looked so sad. My mother brushed past me, carrying linens, her once regal posture bent under the weight of servitude. I remembered her laughter on the day she announced to the wedding guests that Alex had chosen Sarah, her cruel smile carved into my memory. Seeing her diminished should have been sweet. Instead, it was bitter. Alex tried as always to prove himself. He polished silverware until it gleamed, left letters on my desk begging for forgiveness, promising loyalty. I didn't respond. I told myself his desperation was justice. But when James wandered into my office later and saw the unopened letters, he asked Mommy, "Why don't you answer him? He looks like he wants to cry." I wanted to say, "Because he let me cry when I needed him most." I wanted to explain that justice sometimes required silence. But I could see the confusion in James's face, the way he struggled to understand cruelty that didn't fit in his small world. He didn't see betrayal. He saw people in pain. And suddenly I feared that if I kept feeding my revenge, my son might learn that pain was something to hand down generation after generation. That night I lay awake next to David, listening to the rain tapping against our windows, James's words playing in my mind. I had promised myself that I would never be weak again, never let anyone destroy me. But what if in making that vow I had become something even darker? What if the legacy I was building for my son wasn't strength, but bitterness, disguised as power? I rose quietly and stood at the mirror in our bathroom. My reflection stared back, polished, powerful, the woman who had crushed her enemies. But beneath that was a shadow of the bride who had once been abandoned at the altar. I could still see her trembling and humiliated. Was I still trying to protect her? Or had I simply become the mirror image of the people who hurt her? The memory of James's innocent eyes wouldn't leave me. He hadn't meant to accuse, but his honesty had done more than any revenge ever could. It had made me question myself in a way my mother's cruelty never had. His innocent eyes made me wonder, had I become the very thing I once fought against? The weeks following my son's innocent question lingered in my mind like an echo I couldn't silence. For days I carried his words with me into meetings, into long nights at my office, even into the quiet of our home when the world outside had gone still. Every time I looked at him, his small hands, his wide eyes so unburdened by the darkness of betrayal, I wondered what kind of mother I was becoming. I had sworn to protect him from pain, to give him a better childhood than the one I endured, and yet I was teaching him by example that vengeance could consume a life. That realization cut me deeper than any wound my mother or Sarah had ever left on me. Then came the call. A hospital nurse's voice on the other end told me my mother had collapsed at one of my events, where she had been serving drinks to men and women she once gossiped with at country clubs. The words didn't surprise me, but they hit me with an unexpected weight. For years I had dreamed of her collapse in one way or another, not her body giving in, but her pride crumbling. Yet as I drove to the hospital, I realized I had never truly considered what it would mean to stand at her bedside when she was too weak to sneer, too frail to lash out. When I entered the sterile white room, the figure in the bed barely resembled the woman who once stood tall and imperious in our family home. Her hair, once meticulously styled, clung in wisps to her damp forehead. Her eyes, always sharp with judgment, flickered open with a dullness I had never seen. She looked small, diminished, broken, in a way I never imagined possible. For a moment, I didn't see the monster who had orchestrated my humiliation at the altar. I saw an aging woman who had lost everything, her reputation, her control, her illusions of superiority. She reached out a trembling hand, and though I wanted to recoil, I stood rooted to the spot. "You've become everything." "I said you couldn't," she whispered, her voice rasping, each word dragged out as though it might be her last. And maybe I was wrong. There were tears in her eyes, real or not. I couldn't tell, but the sight disarmed me. I didn't forgive her in that moment, but something inside me shifted. I had spent 10 years building an empire out of the ashes she left me in. I had taken everything they tried to steal and turned it into strength. And here she was, broken not by my hand, but by her own choices, her own pride, her own cruelty reflected back at her by the life she created. In that room, I understood something I hadn't before. My true victory wasn't her humiliation or Sarah's collapse. My true victory was that I had become everything they tried to stop me from being. They no longer had the power to define me, not even through their suffering. I left the hospital and drove straight to my office. That night I pulled out the contracts that bound my mother Sarah and Alex to the lowest rungs of my company. I had thought those contracts would be the crown jewel of my revenge, the ultimate humiliation that would satisfy every ache they had left me with. But now as I stared at the neat signatures penned with shaking hands, I felt only a hollow emptiness. The power was mine, yes, but the satisfaction was gone. The next morning I called them into my office. They entered hesitantly. Their uniforms wrinkled, their faces etched with exhaustion. For the first time, I saw not villains, but people stripped bare of all the armor they once wore. My mother's sharp tongue was silent. Sarah's vanity was gone. Alex's bravado reduced to nervous glances at the floor. They were shadows of who they had been, and for the first time I pitied them. "I'm ending this," I told them, my voice calm, steady. Their eyes widened in shock, perhaps expecting I was about to unleash something worse. Instead, I slid the contracts across the desk. "You're free. Not because you deserve it, but because I no longer need this to define me." They didn't thank me. Perhaps they didn't know how, or perhaps gratitude was too heavy for them to carry. But it didn't matter. I hadn't done it for them. I had done it for me, for my son, for the woman I had become, for the future I wanted to shape without dragging the chains of bitterness behind me. As they shuffled out of my office, my mother casting one last bewildered glance in my direction, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not triumphant, not vengeful, but free. The girl abandoned at the altar had finally laid her burden down. I walked to the window and looked out over the city I had once entered with nothing but a suitcase and shattered pride. Now it stretched before me like a kingdom, not because I had destroyed my enemies, but because I had survived them, outgrown them, and no longer needed them as the measure of my worth. In that quiet moment, I knew the truth with a clarity I had never felt before. I realized that the best revenge wasn't destroying them. It was no longer needing to. I chose a quiet afternoon for the meeting. I wanted the air to be calm, the light soft enough to strip away excuses and leave only truth behind. I walked into the room where my mother, Sarah, and Alex were waiting. Their posture spoke more than words ever could. My mother stiff and defiant, Sarah, hollow-eyed, Alex restless as if hoping for an escape that would never come. I sat across from them, and for the first time in my life, I felt no tremor of fear, no sting of insecurity. The balance of power had shifted entirely. They no longer held the ability to define me. That weight was gone, and I was finally free to speak without chains on my tongue. I looked at each of them and said slowly, "I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." The words echoed in the silence. My mother opened her mouth as if to protest, but I raised my hand gently. "No more explanations. No more battles. I carried your betrayal for years, and it almost consumed me. But now I won't carry you anymore." Sarah broke into tears, covering her face with trembling hands. Alex leaned back in his chair, unable to meet my gaze. My mother, for once, looked smaller than I had ever seen her. She didn't argue, didn't fight perhaps, because she knew it was no longer worth it. I stood, letting the silence stretch before adding, "This is the last time we will sit in a room like this. You no longer control my story." "I do." That was the closure I needed. I walked out of that room and into David's arms waiting outside. He didn't need to ask how it went. The steadiness in my stride told him everything. Later that evening, as we sat together by the fire, David looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "There's one more truth I need to share with you," he said. My heart tightened for a moment, but I nodded. He took my hand, his thumb brushing against my wedding ring, the symbol of the life we had built. "My last name isn't just Richardson," he began. "It connects me to someone you once thought of as only part of a shadow in your past. Your biological father, he was a distant relative of mine." I inhaled sharply, memories of whispered rumors and half-truths about my birth flooding my mind. All those years, David continued, our families were tied in ways neither of us fully understood. It was betrayal that destroyed both of us. Your life twisted by lies, mine shattered by embezzlement and loss. But fate brought us together not to repeat that cycle, but to end it. I searched his face for any sign that this was pity or obligation, but what I saw was love, deep, unwavering, born not of circumstance, but of choice. "So you're telling me this was destiny?" I asked softly. He smiled. "I'm telling you that everything cruel in our past led us to build something better, stronger. Together we turned ashes into gold." That night, instead of feeling haunted by the tangled bloodlines and betrayals, I felt something I had never allowed myself before: peace. Our story wasn't tainted by the sins of those before us, it was rewritten by what we chose to become. The next months were filled with plans not of revenge, but of purpose. David and I founded an organization dedicated to abandoned brides, betrayed children, and those discarded by the people meant to protect them. I poured into it every ounce of strength I once wasted, begging for love that would never come from my family. Now I gave that strength to women standing at the edge of despair, letting them know they weren't alone and that pain could be transformed into power. Each time I stood before a room of survivors telling them my story, I watched their eyes widen with recognition, then light with hope. I had become not just a woman who survived betrayal, but someone who could help others build lives untouched by the cruelty of the past. It was the most profound victory of all. And yet, whenever I thought back to that 10-year journey from the altar where I stood abandoned to the empire I built and the family I created, I realized that revenge had never been the endgame. It was the fuel that kept me moving forward. Yes, but it was peace, forgiveness, and love that gave me a destination. As I walked into my new life, I realized that sometimes the best revenge is living so well that the past can never touch you again, and that the family you choose will always be stronger than the one that chose to hurt you. But most importantly, I learned that my husband wasn't just my soulmate, he was the universe's way of saying that justice and love can be the same thing. And that, my dear listeners, is how a bride abandoned at the altar rose from ashes to build an empire, expose betrayal, and transform her deepest wounds into her greatest source of strength. It is a story of heartbreak, revenge, justice, and finally peace. But stories like this are never just about one woman. They are about all of us who have been underestimated, betrayed, or cast aside, and who found a way to rise higher than anyone ever believed we could. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in my shoes, standing at the altar, only to be left for your own sister, what would you have done? Would you have walked away like I did, or confronted them then and there? And 10 years later, if you had the chance to stand tall before the very people who destroyed you, what would you say? Your thoughts and experiences matter, because every voice adds power to this community of resilience and courage. If you found yourself drawn into this story and you want to hear more tales of betrayal, justice, and redemption, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Every week we bring you stories that will shock you, move you, and remind you that sometimes life's greatest pain can become its most powerful triumph. Don't just watch, join the conversation, share your perspective in the comments, and let's keep building a space where stories of strength are never forgotten.